My wife strictly forbade me from ever going to her resort. But after she passed away, the lawyer handed me a key and said, "Now it belongs to you." I was going to sell it, but out of curiosity, I decided to go see it for myself. When I opened the door, I almost stopped breathing, because I realized this wasn't just a property. It was a secret that had been buried for far too long. Thank you for being here with me. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd really like to hear from you. This story carries themes meant to make you think and reflect. Some details are dramatized for storytelling purposes, and any similarities are purely coincidental, but the message may be worth considering. The brass key felt unnervingly warm in my palm, as if it still carried the heat of the woman who had forbidden me from ever seeing the place it unlocked. I sat in the stillness of my Chicago study, a room lined with the heavy, leather-bound volumes of a life spent teaching the great books, and watched the afternoon sunlight dance on the surface of the antique metal. Ethane Garrison, a 67-year-old retired literature professor with graying temples and a steady gaze, was a man who prided himself on understanding the subtext of every story ever written. Yet, as I stared at the key and the maple leaf keychain attached to it, I realized I had failed to read the most important narrative in my own life. 3 months had passed since I stood in the biting wind of Eleanor's funeral, and until today I believed I understood the boundaries of our marriage. We had lived in this brownstone for decades, raising 2 children on a modest academic salary and her earnings as a wildlife photographer. We shared everything, or so I thought, except for one place. The place she made me promise never to visit. "And don't follow me there, Thane," she had said more than once over the years, her voice carrying an edge I never questioned. "That retreat is mine alone. Promise me." I had promised. But now she was gone, and that promise felt like a chain. Then Margaret Caldwell arrived. Eleanor's longtime estate attorney drove 3 hours to hand-deliver the package herself. Margaret Caldwell, 55, stood in my doorway with a leather briefcase and eyes that held too many of my wife's secrets. She placed a heavy box on my desk. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "Eleanor left explicit instructions. I was to give you this exactly 90 days after her passing." She handed me the brass key first, then a thick envelope from Jackson, Wyoming. Her final words, Margaret continued, were, "Now it's his. 24 years. That's 8,760 days of looking into her eyes and seeing only the truth I wanted to see." I realized at that moment that I had been a spectator in my own home, a man who analyzed fictional kings while remaining blind to the woman sitting across the breakfast table. Margaret excused herself, leaving me alone. I took a deep breath, the smell of old parchment filling my lungs, and opened the envelope. "My dearest Thane," the letter began. The handwriting was unmistakable, Eleanor's precise architectural script. "If you are reading this, the time for silence has ended. I am sorry for keeping you away, but I forbade you from Timber Ridge to protect you from questions you weren't ready to answer, and from a son-in-law who would have used your curiosity against us both." I sat back, the air leaving my lungs. Timber Ridge. 3 years. While we were discussing roof repairs or Vanessa's design school tuition, Eleanor was purchasing a mountain estate she refused to let me see. The letter continued, "The property is yours now. It's a conservation sanctuary, and it holds evidence of crimes I couldn't expose while alive. Go there. See what I've built. There is an irrevocable trust. You cannot sell it no matter the pressure. You have 30 days to take possession. Do not trust the smiles of those who share our name. Have you ever felt the floor vanish while sitting perfectly still? My first instinct was brutal: sell it. I pulled out the legal deed. A 580-acre property in Teton Village. Purchase price $1.2 million, paid in full. I felt a sharp sting and realized I had given myself a paper cut. A single drop of blood bloomed on the white paper. 1.2 million. We were the kind of people who looked for sales on winter coats. Whatever this place was, I didn't want it. The maintenance would devour my pension. I could sell it, pay off the brownstone, set up trust funds, and live without Eleanor's secrets. But a deeper voice whispered, what was she hiding? Why did she forbid me? The document described it as a conservation sanctuary, not a vacation home. While I was teaching Shakespearean tragedies, my wife was living a thriller. She had managed a multi-million-dollar asset under my nose, taking photography trips that were clearly something more calculated. The betrayal stung a hot needle in my heart, but underneath was a growing, terrifying curiosity. What was she protecting? The secret was a cold draft in a sealed room. I couldn't see it, but now that I knew it was there, I couldn't stop shivering. I looked at the final page, my eyes scanning the fine print, until a name jumped off the page. The trust was structured with a specific exclusion list, people never to be allowed within Timber Ridge. At the very top, in bold legal font, was Derek Brooks, my son-in-law, the man who had married my younger daughter Vanessa 2 years ago. I had always found Derek to be a bit too polished, a commercial real estate broker with a focus-grouped smile, but Eleanor had always been polite to him. Or so I thought. Now I was holding a document that legally branded him a threat to her legacy. My mind raced. Sell it, the rational voice urged. You don't need this burden. But curiosity, the same instinct that had made me a professor, the same hunger that had driven 40 years of analyzing human motivation, refused to let go. What had Eleanor built in those mountains? What was she so desperate to hide from Derek? The questions burned hotter than any practical concern about maintenance costs or property taxes. The key in my palm seemed to pulse with heat, as if Eleanor's ghost was pushing me toward a truth I wasn't ready to face. I thought of her voice, the way she had said, "Don't follow me there," with such finality. Now I understood. She hadn't been keeping me out. She had been keeping Derek away, and now that she was gone, the fortress she had built needed a new guardian. If Derek was the threat Eleanor feared, why was he currently standing on my front porch, ringing the doorbell with a smile that didn't reach his eyes? I shoved the heavy brass key and the deed into the bottom drawer of my desk, just as the front door rattled under the force of a second, more aggressive knock. The sound of the doorbell chiming a second time, more insistent than the first, echoed through the high ceilings of my study. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Eleanor's warning was still fresh in my mind, the ink on the cream-colored page practically glowing with the threat of those who share our name. I wiped my damp palms on my trousers and moved toward the foyer, the grandfather clock in the corner ticking with a sudden judgmental weight. I pulled the heavy oak door open, and there he was. Derek Brooks, 40, adjusted his expensive Italian suit jacket as he loomed over my threshold, his smile as cold and synthetic as a showroom floor. He was a man of sharp angles and polished surfaces, a commercial real estate broker who spoke in the dialect of market trends and growth potential. He had married my daughter Vanessa 2 years ago, and while I had always tried to be the accommodating patriarch, his presence today felt predatory. He didn't wait for an invitation. He simply stepped into the warmth of the hall, shaking off a few stray flakes of Chicago snow from his cashmere overcoat. "Thane," he said, his voice dropping into that performative baritone he used for closing deals. I was in the neighborhood and saw the courier truck leaving. I thought I should check in. "You look tired, Thane. Let me take some of the legal burden off your plate. I know Eleanor's estate is a mess of paperwork." I felt a surge of protective instinct so sharp it was almost physical. How do you tell the man who married your daughter that you know he is a vulture, without giving away the fact that you are holding the meat? I knew Derek was sharp, but the speed at which he had appeared after the delivery suggested he wasn't just guessing. He had been tracking the Jackson law firm's mailings, waiting for the 90-day clock to run out. I forced a weary smile, the kind a grieving widower was expected to wear. "I have everything under control, Derek." Eleanor was nothing if not organized. The package was just some old correspondence regarding her equipment insurance. Nothing for you to worry about. Derek's eyes flickered toward my study, a hungry, analytical gaze that searched for the box I had hidden. He mentioned a developer friend of his, a man looking for distressed mountain properties, and suggested that if Eleanor had any dead weight in her portfolio, he could facilitate a quick sale. I ushered him back toward the door, lying through my teeth about an early morning flight I had to catch to visit an old colleague. It took another 10 minutes of his oily charm before he finally retreated to his black SUV, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt like a target. 48 hours later, the urban sprawl of Chicago was a world away, replaced by the jagged, unforgiving skyline of the Teton Range. I had picked up a rugged rental SUV at the Jackson Hole Airport, the heavy brass key sitting like a hot coal in my pocket. The drive started under a deceptively clear sky, but as I moved deeper toward Teton Village, the weather turned with a violent suddenness that felt personal. Then the road vanished, not metaphorically. The world simply turned into a swirling, blinding sheet of static. A sudden blizzard swept across the valley, turning the asphalt into a skating rink and the air into a wall of white. The steering wheel vibrated in my grip as the wind tried to shove the vehicle into the ditch. I was alone on a high-altitude road, fighting a storm that felt as though it were guarding the secrets Eleanor had left behind. I realized then that Timber Ridge wasn't just remote. It was fortified by nature itself, a sanctuary that didn't want to be found by a retired professor from the flatlands. My high beams were useless, reflecting off the dancing flakes, until my eyes burned with the strain of searching for a centerline that no longer existed. "Focus," I whispered to myself, my knuckles white on the leather wrap of the wheel. "Just keep the taillights in sight." But there were no other taillights. I was the only fool on the mountain. Low on fuel and losing my sense of direction, I spotted a flickering neon sign through the haze. It was a dilapidated gas station that looked like a relic of the frontier, a sagging structure of rusted, corrugated metal and ancient pumps. I pulled in the whistle of the wind through the SUV's door seals, sounding like a high-pitched scream. As I stepped out, the gritty texture of road salt crunched under my boots, and the smell of ozone and diesel bit at my nose. An elderly man, with skin like cracked leather and a faded work shirt, emerged from the shadows of the garage, moving with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. He didn't offer a greeting. He just stared at the rental's plates and then at my face. I asked him for directions to the address on my GPS, but he stopped mid-pump, the metallic click of the gas handle echoing in the frigid air. "Timber Ridge," he asked, his voice like gravel grinding together. "You're brave, Professor. Or just late to the party? I haven't seen anyone head up that track since the lady passed. The mountain has been quiet for too long." He looked me over with eyes that were like two pieces of flint, ready to spark a fire I wasn't sure I could put out. He warned me that when the weather turns this bad, the mountain wolves don't just hunt for meat. They hunt for those who don't belong. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. He knew who I was. He leaned in close, the scent of diesel and tobacco thick on his breath, and whispered, "She said to tell you the password isn't in the letter. It's in the memory of our first mistake." The massive timber gates loomed out of the whiteout, like the ribs of some prehistoric beast guarding a silence I was about to shatter with a single turn of a brass key. I sat in the idling SUV, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the Wyoming blizzard, and stared at the entrance to Timber Ridge Lodge. The gas station owner's words still clung to me like the scent of his tobacco. He had said the password wasn't in the letter, but in the memory of our first mistake. I reached into my pocket and touched the metal of the key, feeling a surge of analytical determination. I was no longer just a grieving widower. I was a man on the scent of a truth Eleanor had forbidden me from discovering. I pulled the heavy key from my pocket and stepped out into the biting cold, the wind howling through the mountain pass with a ferocity designed to push me back toward Chicago. I struggled with the gate's mechanism, my fingers numbing instantly. When the lock finally clicked, I shoved the timber aside and drove through the tires, crunching over fresh snow. A figure emerged from the swirling white, a lantern swinging in his hand. Henry Thorne, 62, stood by the lodge in a worn fleece jacket, his hands calloused from decades in the Forest Service, and eyes that saw everything Derek thought he was hiding. He didn't look like a property manager. He looked like a sentinel. I later learned that Henry was a retired park ranger whom Eleanor had once cleared of false charges. His loyalty to her was absolute. "You're late, Professor," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "Eleanor said the storm wouldn't stop you." I stared at him, my breath hitching. "You knew she was buying this?" I asked. Henry merely nodded and gestured for me to follow him toward the main structure. The lodge was a masterpiece of fortified luxury stone and dark cedar that looked as if it had grown out of the mountainside. Henry led me through the foyer. The smell of cedar and expensive leather greeted me. In the great room, a fresh fire crackled in a hearth large enough to stand in. Henry explained that he had been hired 3 years ago with one instruction: wait for the man with the brass key. "She didn't just build a home, Thane," he said. "She built a fortress." We reached a heavy door at the end of the wing. Henry unlocked it and stepped aside. "This was her space," he said. The moment I stepped through that door, my breath caught in my throat. The room wasn't just a studio, it was a command center. The far wall was covered floor to ceiling with a massive corkboard displaying surveillance photographs, topographical maps marked with red zones, and a printed timeline spanning 3 years. At the center was a large photograph of Derek Brooks, his face circled in red marker with dozens of strings connecting to other images, casino receipts, bank statements, legal documents, and covert photos of him meeting with men in expensive suits. My legs felt weak. This wasn't a photography retreat. It was an intelligence operation. Henry stood silent as I moved closer. I saw images of our Chicago home, aerial shots of this lodge, and detailed maps of the 580 acres with zones marked critical habitat and water rights boundary. There were folders labeled with dates, all organized with Eleanor's meticulous precision. In the corner, a heavy oak desk held a high-end computer, multiple monitors, and a locked drawer. "Do you know what it's like to realize your wife's quiet hobby required a security budget larger than your retirement fund?" "This is what she forbade me from seeing," whispered. Henry nodded. "She said you weren't ready. Not while she was alive." I moved to the desk, my hands trembling. The orange firelight reflected off high-tech security monitors recessed into the stone walls, showing live feeds from cameras around the property. Henry pointed out a hidden compartment in the desk, sliding a panel away to reveal a USB drive. He handed it to me, and the small device felt heavier than it should have weighted with the gravity of Eleanor's words. "The password?" I asked. Henry shook his head. "She said you'd know it. Something about a first mistake." He left me alone. I sat at the desk, the blue glow of the laptop screen making the room feel subterranean. I stared at the password prompt, my mind racing through 40 years of shared history. Our first mistake. To a literature professor, mistakes are the engines of plot. But Eleanor wasn't interested in tropes. She was interested in us. I thought of our early years, the struggles with tenure, but none felt singular. Then a memory surfaced from 1978. Our honeymoon. I had tried to save money by booking a cheap motel on the outskirts of Niagara Falls. It was a disastrous, crumbling place called the Alibi. We had spent 6 frantic hours convinced we had lost our wedding rings down a rusted drain, only to find them tucked inside a glove box. The motel was called the Alibi. How fitting. My entire life had become an alibi for a woman I never truly knew. I typed the date followed by the name 0612788ALIBI. The drive opened with a soft, digital chime. On the screen, 52 folders appeared, each labeled by week. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. She had planned for an entire year of my life without her. I clicked on the first folder, my finger hovering over the mouse as if it were a trigger. The video file was timestamped to play only once, a final safeguard, proving Eleanor knew exactly when I would arrive. The video flickered to life, and there she was. Eleanor Garrison, 64, appeared on the laptop screen with the vibrant energy of her pre-cancer days. Her camera-ready smile masking the tactical genius she had hidden from her husband for decades. She was vibrant and healthy, leaning toward the camera with a look that told me my life in Chicago was officially over. My heart thrashed against my ribs as I looked into her eyes, seeing a fire there that I had never recognized when she was alive. The sound of Eleanor's voice captured a year ago filled the library like a haunting melody. I sat frozen as her image on the screen breathed a life that was no longer hers. Her eyes bright with a secret intelligence I was only beginning to grasp. I didn't even have time to wipe the tears from my eyes before the crunch of heavy tires on frozen gravel signaled that the wolves the old man warned me about had finally found the gate. The transition from the warmth of Eleanor's digital presence to the cold reality of an intrusion was violent. I hurriedly paused the video, the image of my wife's smile lingering before the screen went black. I closed the laptop with a snap that felt like a betrayal. Through the library window, I watched a sleek black SUV come to a halt in the driveway, its polished surface a dark stain against the pristine Wyoming snow. I knew that vehicle. More importantly, I knew the people inside. Derek Brooks emerged first, adjusting his coat with a practiced arrogance that even a blizzard couldn't dampen. Behind him came my daughter. Vanessa Garrison Brooks, 35, stepped out with a designer handbag clutched tight against her chest, her eyes darting toward Derek, as if checking for permission to speak. They shouldn't have been here. There was no way they could have known about this property through public records so quickly. They had followed me. Derek had likely placed a tracker on my rental or monitored my flight patterns the moment I left Chicago. From the shadows of the porch, Henry Thorne appeared, his hand resting near his belt. He caught my eye through the glass, a silent query etched into his weathered features. Should I send them back? I took a steadying breath. No, Henry. Let them in. It's time to see their hands. Why is it that the people who claim to love you the most are always the first ones to tell you that you've lost your mind? As I walked into the great room to meet them, I could already hear Derek's voice booming an artificial warmth that didn't reach the rafters. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the orange light felt weak against the predatory energy Derek brought into the house. He didn't wait for a greeting. He began walking the perimeter, his eyes scanning the high ceilings and custom stonework, like a surveyor standing over a fresh grave. Vanessa remained by the heavy front door, her fingers twisting the strap of her handbag with frantic energy. She looked smaller here, swallowed by the vastness of the sanctuary Eleanor had built. Dad, she started, her voice thin and brittle. You shouldn't be here alone. It's dangerous, and Eleanor. She wasn't herself when she did this. She was sick, Dad. Confused. I looked past her to Derek, who was now running a finger along a mahogany bookshelf. I've never felt more at home, Vanessa, I said, my voice sounding like gravel, and your mother knew exactly where I belonged. But even as I said those words, a small voice whispered doubts. What was I doing here? A 67-year-old widower playing caretaker to a fortress I didn't understand, in a wilderness that would cost a fortune to maintain. Maybe Vanessa was right. Maybe this was dangerous. Maybe the smart thing was to sell and let someone else carry Eleanor's burden. Derek turned, then the flickering orange light reflected in his glasses. He didn't offer condolences. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a thick leather portfolio, dropping it onto the coffee table with a heavy thud that echoed through the lodge. The fire popped a sharp crack of pine like a gunshot. I didn't touch the portfolio. I could smell the corporate ink from where I stood, mixed with his expensive cologne and the wood smoke. It's a buyout offer. Thane Derek set his tone, shifting into the smooth register of a closer. $28 million, Golden Peak Development. They want the land for a private resort. He framed the sanctuary as a financial sinkhole, a sentimental trap Eleanor had constructed in her final delusional months. He spoke of taxes, maintenance, and the impossibility of an aging professor managing 500 acres of wilderness. Think of the security, Thane, he continued. You can go back to Chicago and never worry about a leaking roof again. Set up trust funds for the grandchildren. Live comfortably. Eleanor would have wanted that for you. You sign the intent to sell, and we handle the legal mess. If you wait past the 30-day clause, the courts will get involved. It will get messy. For a moment, I hesitated. The rational part of my brain whispered that Derek might be right. What did I know about managing a conservation sanctuary? What did I know about Wyoming winters or property taxes on 580 acres? I was a literature professor, not a wilderness guardian. $28 million. That was real security. Real safety. I could sell it, honor Eleanor's memory in other ways, and spare myself the burden of a secret I barely understood. But then I looked at Derek's face. I saw the hunger there, the predatory gleam that had nothing to do with concern for my welfare. And I remembered Eleanor's letter. Do not trust the smiles of those who share our name. I felt a cold fury rising within me, burning away the doubt. This land isn't for sale, Derek, I said, my voice steady. Not for 28 million, and not for a cent more. Derek's smile faltered. He took a step closer, the synthetic perfection finally beginning to fray. He revealed then that he hadn't just fielded an offer. He had been in contact with Golden Peak for months. He had been negotiating the price of this soil while Eleanor was still breathing, while she was sitting in our Chicago home planning my future. The betrayal was so absolute it was almost beautiful in its purity. Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that made the distant howl of the wind through the eaves sound like a choir. You think that trust is a shield? Thane, he asked, his shadow stretching long across the floor. By the end of the week, I'll have a judge convinced it's your coffin. I'll have you declared incompetent before you can watch the next video. The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was more violent than Derek's threats. A heavy, suffocating weight that smelled of ozone and broken trust. I stood in the center of the great room, my hands still curled into fists, listening to the fading roar of the SUV's engine as it tore away through the snow. Derek's final words echoed in the high rafters of the lodge, a promise to turn this sanctuary into my coffin. I felt a cold tremor of fury, but underneath it was a hollow ache of disappointment. I looked toward the library, the only room that still felt like it belonged to the woman I knew. Retreating into that space, I sought the digital ghost of Eleanor, the only person who could explain why the man who called me father was now measuring me for a shroud. I reopened the laptop, the screen illuminating my face with a blue-white glare that reflected in my glasses. I clicked on the Week 1 file again, but this time I let the video play past the initial greeting. Eleanor sat in the same chair I was currently occupying, but her face was pale, her eyes carrying a weary wisdom that I had been too distracted to notice during our final months together. Thane, she said, her voice dropping into a register of profound sorrow. I didn't want our final year to be a countdown. I wanted it to be a sanctuary. That is why I didn't tell you. I have stage 3 ovarian cancer. I've had it for 18 months. The room seemed to tilt. 18 months. She carried a death sentence in her purse for 547 days, while I complained about the price of gas and wondered why she was taking so many photography trips to the West. Those trips weren't for the light or the wildlife. They were for aggressive treatments in specialized clinics and for the secret construction of this very house. She tearfully asked for my forgiveness, explaining that she needed me to remember her as a vibrant wife, not a fading patient. She had spent her final strength building a fortress where I could be safe from the fallout of a secret she was only now revealing. Eleanor's expression on the screen shifted from grief to a cold, tactical hardness. But it isn't just the disease I was hiding from you, Thane. It's Derek. She revealed that she hadn't just discovered Derek's financial ruin. She had actively monitored it. Derek is a gambler who has lost his soul, she said, and he will try to take yours next. She explained that she had intercepted emails proving Derek owed over $800,000 to underground gambling syndicates, dangerous men who didn't care about family ties or legal freezes. Then came the twist that made my blood run cold. She didn't just find his debt. She had used a shell company to buy a portion of it. She was literally Derek's creditor, holding the collectors at bay just long enough to ensure this lodge was finished and the trust was ironclad. She knew that once she was gone, Derek would view me as the final obstacle to his payout. He's not just greedy, my love. He's cornered. And a cornered man is capable of unthinkable accidents. Check the third drawer of the darkroom desk. I left you a roadmap of his sins. Would you have the strength to let the person you love most believe a lie, just to give them one last year of peace? I sat in the dark for a long time after the video ended, the static hiss of the audio still humming in my ears. I felt small, a man who had lived in a fictional world of books while my wife was playing a high-stakes game of survival. I eventually found the strength to walk to the darkroom. I found the hidden compartment Eleanor mentioned and pulled out a thick file. It was a ledger of Derek's betrayals, a meticulous record of every lie he had told, and every dollar he had stolen from his own clients to feed his addiction. I took the file and went to find Henry Thorne. He was in the mudroom cleaning a pair of heavy snowshoes. He didn't look surprised when I told him what I'd seen. She was a general professor. Henry said, his voice low and steady. She just never let you see the uniform. She paid my salary 3 years in advance because she knew Derek wouldn't come alone. He told me Eleanor had instructed him to watch for unfamiliar vehicles and to prepare for a siege. We didn't waste any more time. Henry led me outside into the freezing night. The mountain air bit at my skin, and the cold camera housings sent a stinging numbness through my fingertips as I helped him mount the high-definition motion sensors at the lodge's blind spots. The moon was a sliver of ice in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. We moved in silence, the only sound the crunch of crusty snow under Henry's heavy boots and the metallic scent of cold iron tools. I felt a grim sense of empowerment as we reinforced the perimeter. We were no longer just waiting. We were preparing. Henry mentioned that Eleanor had gone even further than physical security. The entire system was linked to a private server in Switzerland. If my heartbeat tracked by the smartwatch Eleanor had insisted I wear ever stopped abruptly, the server would automatically broadcast every piece of evidence she'd gathered directly to the sheriff's office. The cameras we mounted were black, unblinking eyes, artificial predators designed to catch a man who thought he was at the top of the food chain. We finished the installation just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the peaks. We returned to the security room to sync the feeds. I watched the monitors flicker to life, providing a 360-degree view of the white wasteland surrounding us. It felt like a triumph, a technological wall between me and Derek's greed. But as the final camera flickered to life on the monitor, a single red dot appeared on the heat signature map. Someone was already standing in the tree line watching us. The red blossom on the thermal monitor didn't blink. It just hovered there like a bleeding eye in the middle of a white void, watching us watch it. The figure in the trees didn't move, a static shadow against the shifting white of the blizzard that made my skin crawl with a vulnerability I had never felt within the walls of a classroom. Henry Thorne stood beside me, his reflection in the security glass hard and unyielding. We scrambled to identify the signature, but the mountain geography was a fickle mistress. Just as Henry leaned in to adjust the contrast, the heat bloom flickered and vanished into the gray soup of the storm. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. The silence of the lodge was suddenly heavy. broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the surveillance hard drive recording the emptiness. Henry reached for his sidearm, the leather of his holster creaking with a sound that seemed deafening. He checked the perimeter locks with a grim efficiency, his jaw set in a line of weathered granite. "Don't go out there, Henry," I whispered, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "That's exactly what they want. They want us scattered." Henry didn't look back as he checked the deadbolt on the mudroom door. "I'm not going to let them touch this house, Thane," he grunted. "Not after what she paid for it. We spent the night in shifts, a weary professor and an old ranger guarding a fortress that felt increasingly like a cage. I sat in the darkened security room, watching the monitors until the pixels seemed to burn into my retinas. I kept thinking about the heat signature. It had been so perfectly placed, so still. It was only later, when the adrenaline had subsided into a cold, analytical thrum, that the truth began to take shape. The signature wasn't a person standing still. It was a dummy, a decoy rigged with chemical heat packs. It was a tactical lure designed to keep our eyes glued to the tree line while the real threat approached from the blind spot behind the propane tanks. One spark. That's all it would have taken to turn this multi-million-dollar legacy into a crater in the side of the mountain. It was a realization that made the hair on my neck stand up. Derek wasn't just coming for the deed. He was coming for the foundation. I must have drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, because the next thing I knew, I was bolting upright. It was 2:30 a.m. A sharp, cloying scent had invaded the master suite, a rotten egg stench of mercaptan that signaled a massive gas leak. My head throbbed with a dizzying pressure, the first signs of carbon monoxide poisoning beginning to cloud my thoughts. I stumbled toward the hallway, my legs feeling like lead. I reached for the light switch, my fingers centimeters from the plastic toggle, when a hand clamped around my wrist like an iron band. "Thane, don't touch that switch." Henry's voice was a harsh command in the gloom. He dragged me back away from the spark that would have ignited the house. He had a gas mask strapped to his face and shoved another into my hands. We retreated to the utility yard, the numbing cold of the mountain air a sudden mercy against the poison in my lungs. Henry knelt by the external propane tank, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The main line had been unscrewed, the brass coupling hanging loose. How do you breathe when the very air in your home has been weaponized against you? Henry pointed his light at the threads of the pipe. "Look at the marks, Professor. This wasn't a loose fit. Someone used a wrench. This was a calculated strike, a silent executioner that nearly turned the lodge into a bomb." By dawn, the blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving a world buried in 3 feet of deceptive white silence. I stood on the porch, my temples still throbbing from the gas, as a cruiser made its way up the winding drive. Sheriff Sarah Reynolds, a woman with a face as weathered as the Teton granite, and eyes that had seen too many mountain accidents, stepped out of her vehicle. She moved with the weary authority of the only law for 50 miles, her boots crunching on the frozen gravel. I showed her the severed line and the thermal footage, my heart hammering with a desperate need for justice. She reviewed the grainy files in the great room, her expression unreadable. She admitted the line had been tampered with, but her investigation was already being strangled by the very snow that had nearly been my shroud. The fresh powder had erased all footprints, and the thermal signature was, as she put it, legally invisible. "I can't arrest a thermal signature, Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice a flat, tired drawl. "The figure was masked on public land, and the gas leak. Well, a good lawyer would call it a mechanical failure due to the freeze." I felt a surge of frustrated helplessness. "So I'm supposed to just wait for the next spark to finish the job?" I demanded, the anger finally breaking through my analytical shell. Sheriff Reynolds looked at me then, and for the first time her professional mask slipped. She recognized my name. She told me she was the one who had investigated the Michael Torres hit and run back in 2020. She knew about the hush money file Eleanor had left behind in the bunker. It was a revelation that hit me harder than the cold. My wife hadn't just built a house. She had built a web of influence and debt that reached into the very heart of the local law. Trust the police, they say. But what do you do when the law requires a body before it can provide a shield? Reynolds didn't offer a solution. She offered a warning. She paused at her cruiser, the engine idling in the cold morning air. She looked back at me with eyes full of a pity that felt like a death sentence. "Thane, if you stay here, you aren't a trustee," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "You're just a target in a very expensive shooting gallery." She pulled away, leaving me alone with Henry and the ghosts of Eleanor's secrets, the mountain looming above us like a silent witness to a crime that hadn't finished happening yet. I watched the sheriff's taillights bleed into the falling snow like two fading embers, leaving me in a house that had tried to breathe fire into my lungs just hours before. The bluish tint of the morning light on the snow offered a deceptive tranquility, a sharp contrast to the metallic taste of adrenaline that still coated the back of my throat. I retreated into the kitchen, the heavy silence of the lodge broken only by the low, indifferent hum of the refrigerator. I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. It felt like a lifeline to a world I no longer recognized. My hands were still trembling, a fine, persistent vibration that reached up into my forearms as I dialed the number for my son. My son, Ethan Garrison, 38, spoke with the rapid-fire intensity of a man who spent more time with data and mountain lions than people, his voice cracking through the Montana cell service. He didn't ask how I was. He had heard through the university grapevine about Eleanor's secret Wyoming purchase, and his mind was already miles ahead of the pleasantries. "Dad, you have no idea what you're sitting on?" he said, his words tripping over each other. "I've been looking at the topographical surveys of that region for years. That 580 acres isn't just a scenic view. It's a critical migratory corridor for the Canada lynx. It's a biological bottleneck. Is it possible for a man to fall in love with his wife all over again?" Even as he realizes she was a stranger for half their marriage, I sank into a kitchen chair, the cold air from the faulty propane lines still seeming to cling to the corners of the room. Ethan continued his frantic lecture, revealing a secret that Eleanor had kept even from me. He confessed that for the last 5 years, Eleanor had been funneling small research grants to his department at the University of Montana through an anonymous trust. She wasn't just taking photos on those trips, Ethan said. She was mapping the links. She was providing the data we needed to prove that property is one of the last active denning sites in the Teton foothills. She was funding the very research that could protect the land from people like Derek. I listened as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into a jagged, magnificent shape. My wife hadn't just been a photographer. She had been a silent architect of a legal and biological fortress. Ethan's voice grew more determined as he outlined the defense I so desperately needed. He explained the power of the Endangered Species Act. If we can confirm an active dendad, the federal government will designate that land as a critical habitat. It won't matter what Derek's developers want. They won't be able to touch a single blade of grass. Derek likely knows this, which is why he's trying to scare you off before the spring survey. The information was a whetstone sharpening my resolve. The law. It's a blunt instrument until you find the right edge, and Eleanor had found a diamond grade one. I asked Ethan how we were supposed to prove the existence of a cat that people called the ghost cat. "We find the tracks, Dad," he replied. "And then we find the den. We need physical proof, scat hair, or a high-definition image of an active mother." I looked out the window at the vast white wilderness of the Western Ridge. The task felt impossible, yet for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man with a mission. After I hung up with Ethan, I brewed a pot of coffee, the smell of the dark roast fighting back the lingering scent of mercaptan. I took a mug into the library and opened the second folder on the USB drive. Eleanor's face appeared again, but the somber tone of the first video had been replaced by a spark of the passion I remembered from our youth. She spoke directly about her obsession with the lynx she had named Selena. She described years of tracking the cat through the rocky outcrops 400 yards past the creek. She wasn't just talking about a hobby anymore. She was giving me orders. "Protect the ridge, Thane," she said, her eyes boring into mine from the screen. "The future of a species is tucked into that outcrop. I bought Timber Ridge because Selena chose it first. If she loses that den, the population in this corridor collapses." She revealed the dark underbelly of the threat I was facing. Derek's development firm, Golden Peak, had been illegally clear-cutting adjacent land for months, and the Lynx Den was the only thing standing in the way of a federal lawsuit that would dismantle his entire operation. Eleanor's voice was the warm current in the middle of a frozen lake. Dangerous to follow, but the only thing keeping me from sinking. She told me exactly where she had left the high-tech trail cameras hidden in the third drawer of the darkroom desk, and instructed me on how to set the bait stations. I realized then that my survival and the survival of the lynx were inextricably linked. If I could prove the cat existed, I could save the land and myself. If I failed, Derek would pave over everything Eleanor had died to protect. She leaned into the camera, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made me lean closer to the monitor. "But Thane, remember, Derek isn't the only wolf at the door. Watch the water rights. They're more valuable than the land." The video cut to black, leaving me in the blue-white glare of the screen, my mind racing with the weight of the new responsibility. I stood up and walked toward the darkroom, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. I found the cameras exactly where she said they would be. They were heavy, high-tech instruments, the texture of the matte black casings cool beneath my fingers. I looked at the gear and then at the window. The blizzard had left a clean slate of white across the ridge, a perfect canvas for the tracks I needed to find. I was a retired professor of literature, a man of words and quiet rooms, but my wife had decided I was going to be a tracker. I had no choice but to learn. I strapped on the snowshoes Eleanor had hidden in the darkroom, the rhythmic crunch-clack of the frames against the ice, sounding like the ticking of a clock I was desperately trying to outrun. The gear from the darkroom was heavier than I expected, a physical burden to match the weight of the secret I was now carrying. Every step into the frozen backcountry of Timber Ridge felt like an intrusion into a world that had existed perfectly well without me for decades. I adjusted the straps of my pack, the stinging cold biting at my cheeks as I moved toward the western ridge. Henry Thorne moved ahead of me, his pace effortless despite the deep powder, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line with the practiced focus of a man who had spent his life reading the mountain like a familiar manuscript. We were deep into the pine forests now, where the air was thin and smelled sharply of resin and ancient stone. My lungs felt like they were full of glass, each breath a sharp reminder of my age and the sedentary life I had left behind in Chicago. Following those tracks was like reading a ghost story written in the snow, each print a word I was only beginning to translate. We found them near the base of the rocky outcrop Eleanor had marked on her topographical map. They were large, round paw prints, perfectly preserved in the fresh crust of the morning snow. I knelt down, my breath blooming in a white cloud, as I measured the spread with my gloved hand. They were too large for a bobcat, and far too light for a cougar. Henry joined me, crouching with a grim sort of satisfaction. "Look at the toe spread, Professor," he whispered as if the cat could hear us from miles away. "She's real. Selena is still here. This is a Canada lynx, and based on the direction she's heading, straight for the den site Eleanor identified." I felt a surge of adventurous wonder, a spark of the passion that must have driven Eleanor during those long photography trips. But the physical grit required to stay here was becoming a daily tax on my resolve. "My lungs feel like they're full of glass, Henry," I admitted, leaning against a frost-covered boulder, "but I'm not stopping." We spent the next hour carefully mounting the trail cameras Eleanor had provided, positioning them to catch any movement along the narrow game trail that led upward. While resting at the Eagle Peak lookout, Henry pointed his calloused finger toward the valley floor where a frozen creek snaked through the timber. He explained that this wasn't just a picturesque stream. It was the primary headwater system for the entire county. Timber Ridge holds the senior water rights, Thane, he said, his voice hard. Eleanor fought like a cornered wolf to keep that detail out of the initial property assessment. She knew that if developers got their hands on this land, they wouldn't just be building a resort. They'd be seizing control of the water to facilitate fracking on the adjacent federal lands. The land is the skin, Thane. The water rights are the blood. Eleanor knew that. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Derek's $28 million offer wasn't just a lowball. It was a calculated theft of the region's most precious resource. How much of a man's morality is just a luxury he discards? When the bank account hits zero, I felt a cold, intellectual outrage clear the fog of my physical exhaustion. This wasn't just about a house or a cat. It was about the survival of the entire ecosystem. We returned to the lodge as the winter sun began its rapid descent, casting long purple shadows across the snow. I found Derek waiting for me on the porch, the smell of expensive bourbon and cold sweat preceding him. He had abandoned his corporate facade, his Italian suit rumpled and his tie hanging loose. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. "Thane, we need to talk," he said, his voice cracking. "Forget the 28 million. I've talked to my partners. We can go to 40. 40 million, Thane. You could buy 10 brownstones in Chicago and never have to look at a snowflake again. Just sign the damn intent letter today." I stood my ground, the heavy gear still strapped to my back, looking at him with a detachment that seemed to infuriate him further. "Desperation doesn't suit you, Derek," I said quietly, "and it certainly doesn't change the law. 40 million. The number sounded like a prayer from a dying man. But Derek wasn't praying to God. He was praying to gold. I realized then that his offer was a complete lie, a final frantic attempt to secure the deed to use as collateral for a high-interest loan. He didn't have the money. He had only the debt. Henry stepped onto the porch behind me, a silent, looming presence that made Derek flinch. I watched Derek reach for a cigarette, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely strike the match. It was then that the truth about Eleanor's baiting surfaced. Henry casually mentioned that Eleanor had been strategically placing scents along the ridge for months before her passing, to ensure the links would be active and visible for my arrival. She had choreographed this entire encounter from the grave, leading me by the hand toward the evidence I needed. Derek's phone buzzed in his pocket, a sharp, demanding vibration. He pulled it out, and as he read the screen, the color drained from his face instantly. He looked at me, not with the calculated rage of a businessman, but with the pure, unadulterated terror of a cornered animal. Whatever was in that text message had stripped away the last of his pretenses. He didn't say another word, nearly stumbling, as he scrambled back to his SUV and tore out of the driveway, leaving a spray of gravel and slush in his wake. I stood on the porch, the silence of the mountain returning, but the air felt heavier now, charged with the approaching legal storm. The terror in Derek's eyes wasn't for me. It was for the invisible ghosts of his own making, and as his tires screeched away, I realized the wolves were finally turning on their own. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the taillights vanish into the gray mountain mist, feeling a strange, hollow victory. The legal documents from Margaret Caldwell arrived by courier the next morning, heavy with the permanence of Wyoming law. Margaret Caldwell, 55. The garrison's estate attorney walked into the great room with a leather briefcase that seemed to weigh more than she did, her sharp eyes scanning the lodge for any sign of Derek. She was a woman who spoke in the precise, unyielding language of statutes and precedents. She sat me down and spread the finalized trust documents across the oak table like a general laying out a battle map. "You're not just a homeowner anymore, Thane," she said, her voice echoing in the high rafters. "You're a sovereign protector. The 30-day transfer freeze has expired. You are now the absolute lifetime trustee." She then pointed to a specific paragraph that Eleanor had insisted upon, the moral turpitude clause. "If Derek is ever convicted of a felony, He is legally severed from any potential future inheritance through Vanessa. Eleanor didn't just build a house, Margaret whispered. She built a legal fortress. How many men get to stand at the edge of their own lives and see the legal walls rising to protect them? I felt a profound sense of strategic relief. Margaret left me with a firm handshake and a warning to keep the gates locked. What followed was a 7-week vigil, a montage of days that blurred together in a quiet, snowy haze. I adhered strictly to Eleanor's schedule, watching one video every Sunday, like a sacred ritual. I spent my days cataloging the local flora with Henry and Ethan, who began visiting more frequently, his rugged presence a comfort in the isolation. We set up tracking stations and monitored the game trails, finding more evidence of Selena the lynx moving through the western ridge. But the absence of Derek was unnervingly quiet. He had vanished from the property, but his shadow remained. Desperate men don't just disappear, I told Henry one afternoon while we were checking the perimeter. Henry adjusted his cap, his eyes scanning the tree line. Enjoy the silence while it lasts, Professor. The storm is just catching its breath. Then came the silence. 49 days of it. A quiet so deep I could hear the mountain breathing. Every morning I woke up and wondered if today would be the day the other shoe dropped. I became hyper-aware of every sound, the settling of the timber, the whistle of the wind, the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the library. I was a man living in a suspense novel of my own wife's design. I realized that Eleanor had timed everything with the precision of a Swiss watch. She knew exactly how long it would take for Derek's creditors to lose patience. In a midweek video, she revealed a staggering detail. She had already prepaid Derek's gambling creditors for an additional 60 days through an anonymous account. She had bought me time, ensuring Derek stayed focused on the lodge instead of vanishing into the wind before she could trap him. It was a terrifying level of foresight. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. I was the bait, and she was the hunter, even from the grave. Day 49 finally arrived. I sat in the library, the flickering screen of the laptop casting long shadows against the bookshelves. I opened the folder marked Week 7. Eleanor appeared on the screen, visibly thinner now, her skin like pale parchment, but her eyes were sharp, glowing with a fierce, final intelligence. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She warned me that Derek was likely moving into his final phase, planning an industrial accident, or perhaps a mental health intervention, to strip my power. "It's time, Thane," she said. "The code is 091545. Our beginning is the end of his lies. Go down, Thane. See what he's been trying to hide from the world." The combination lock didn't just open a door. It unzipped the skin of our reality to show the bones beneath. I walked to the east wing into her old studio. I moved the books on the third shelf, just as she described, revealing a heavy steel keypad recessed into the wall. I entered our wedding anniversary, the date our life together truly began. The combination lock clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The bookshelf hissed as a hidden hydraulic system swung it wide, revealing a reinforced steel door. As the door swung open, the smell that wafted out wasn't of old paper or dust, but of sterile hospital air and a specific bitter chemical I hadn't smelled since the day Eleanor died. I stood on the threshold, my heart hammering against my ribs. The cold air rushing from the bunker felt like a physical hand pushing against my chest. I took a breath, the antiseptic scent stinging my nostrils. The Week 7 video had one last revelation that shattered what remained of my composure. Eleanor looked directly into the lens, a single tear tracking through the makeup she'd worn to hide her decline. Derek didn't wait for the cancer, Thane. He tried to poison my hospice medication. I swapped the vials. The proof is in the safe. I realized then that I wasn't just walking into a storage room. I was walking into a crime scene that had been preserved in ice for a year. I stepped into the darkness of the bunker, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel, illuminating rows of filing cabinets and a small medical-grade refrigerator. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle of the safe. Eleanor hadn't just protected the land. She had spent her final months ensuring that the man who tried to kill her would never have the chance to finish the job on me. The bunker didn't smell like a secret. It smelled like the end of the world, or at least the sterile, white-tiled version of it, where Eleanor had spent her final days. I stepped into the darkness of the vault, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel. I had expected dust and the heavy scent of old paper, but instead my nostrils were stung by the sharp, clinical odor of ozone and medicine. This wasn't just a storage room. It was a laboratory of betrayal. As the beam swept across the steel shelves, I saw rows of filing cabinets and a small medical-grade refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. Eleanor's voice from the video echoed in my mind, a ghostly guide through this subterranean archive. I realized then that she hadn't just been hiding property. She was documenting a crime scene. I found a metal case on a central table, and inside, tucked beside vials, was an emergency medical kit. My breath hitched when I read the handwritten label, Antidote, Digoxin Toxicity. Eleanor had looked through time and seen the exact weapon Derek would choose. Beneath the kit was a sealed envelope. Thane, why I forbade you. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. My darling, the letter began. If you're reading this, you've seen the wall in my studio. You know now what I was protecting you from. I forbade you from Timber Ridge not because I didn't trust you, but because Derek was watching. Every question you asked, every curiosity you showed would have tipped him off that I knew. I needed you ignorant to keep you safe. I needed you far away so he would focus on me, not you. Forgive me for the prohibition. It was the only way to buy time. I moved to the first filing cabinet, the heavy drawer sliding open with a metallic hiss. Inside were logs dated and cross-referenced with precision. My fingers brushed over the tabs. Derek. Financials, Derek. Correspondence, Derek. Medical interference. I pulled out medical interference and felt nausea wash over me. It contained the original hospice drugs that had been swapped out during Eleanor's final weeks. There were logs of Derek's attempts to adjust her dosages to confuse her care team to accelerate the inevitable. The bitter smell was explained by a note clipped to a glass jar. It was a chemical stabilizer Eleanor used to preserve the integrity of the tampered samples. Records, not photos of mountains or cats, but logs of a man trying to kill my wife while I was busy teaching King Lear. I had spent my life analyzing tragic heroes, while a real monster was sitting at my dinner table pouring wine and asking about my syllabus. The weight of my ignorance felt like a physical blow. I emerged from the bunker at dawn, the gray light of a Wyoming morning bleeding over the peaks. I felt physically exhausted, my joints aching from the cold vault, but my mind vibrated with hyper-focused energy. I followed my standard morning routine with mechanical detachment. I brewed coffee, the smell of the beans failing to mask the phantom scent of the bunker's ozone. I stood at the kitchen island, staring out at the western ridge, searching for any sign of Selena. I checked the trail cam feed on my tablet, seeing only wind-blown pine branches. It was time for my blood pressure medication. I reached for the plastic pill organizer, the metallic click of the lid sounding unusually sharp. I failed to notice that the safety seal I usually kept across the Wednesday slot had been expertly disturbed, the plastic edge smoothed back with a surgical hand. Just another day, Thane, I whispered. Stay the course. I swallowed the pill with lukewarm coffee, unaware that I had just invited a silent executioner into my bloodstream. Have you ever wondered what the exact moment of a betrayal feels like? It's not a knife. It's a pill that tastes like nothing. Within 30 minutes, the world began to tilt. I was standing by the sink when the first yellow halos appeared, shimmering rings of light that pulsed at the edges of my vision. I tried to blink them away, but they only grew brighter, a sickly neon hue that turned the snowy landscape outside into a fever dream. Then the pressure started. My heart, usually a steady drum, began to thrash in my chest like a trapped bird. It wasn't a heart attack. It was an electrical siege, digoxin toxicity. The drug was forcing my heart into a rhythm it couldn't sustain. I tried to cry out for Henry, but my throat felt constricted, the muscles of my neck locking up. I reached for the wall-mounted phone, my fingers clawing at the wood, but the distance seemed to stretch into infinity. My legs buckled, and I hit the slate floor with a heavy thud that rattled my teeth. The cold stone pressed against my cheek, a brutal contrast to the heat radiating from my chest. My heart wasn't beating anymore. It was a frantic drummer in a room with no air. I lay there, my vision narrowing into a pinprick of yellow light, the sounds of the lodge fading into a muffled roar. I could hear the wind whistling through the eaves, a mournful sound that seemed to be singing a dirge for the last of the garrisons. "Help, Henry." The words were a silent plea trapped behind lips that wouldn't move. I felt the darkness closing in a heavy curtain that promised an end to the agony. Just as my eyes began to roll back, I heard the mudroom door creaking open. A shadow moved across the threshold, blocking the morning light. I fought to focus my yellow-tinged vision, straining to identify the figure. It wasn't Derek. It was Vanessa. She stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of unreadable emotion. In her hand, she held a small glass vial, her knuckles white from the grip. She didn't scream. She didn't run to me. She simply stood there watching the life drain out of my face, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I looked up at my daughter, my vision blurring into a final haze, and realized the person I had raised was either my savior or my executioner. The darkness finally took me. The sound of the heart monitor was a rhythmic, artificial lie, telling me I was still alive when every fiber of my being felt like it had been turned to ash. I drifted in a sea of sterile white, the antiseptic sting of the hospital air burning my nostrils. Each high-pitched beep of the EKG was a needle prick in the silence, grounding me back to a reality I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to inhabit. My chest felt like it had been crushed under the weight of a mountain, a lingering, dull ache remaining where my heart had nearly given up its frantic dance. I remembered the cold slate of the kitchen floor, the yellow halos pulsing in my vision, and the image of Vanessa, my daughter, my flesh and blood. She had stood there in the doorway, a silent spectator to my extinction. I tried to swallow, but my throat was a desert, and the metallic taste of the hospital water I had been given earlier lingered on my tongue like copper. I struggled to open my eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights of St. John's Hospital in Jackson, feeling like an assault. A shadow moved near the door, a solid, familiar presence that didn't belong to a nurse. Henry Thorne was standing guard, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression as unreadable as Teton granite. When he saw me stir, he simply nodded. A silent sentinel acknowledging the battle wasn't over. Doctor Bellamy, a specialist with a clinical detachment that didn't quite hide his concern, adjusted his stethoscope as he leaned over my chart. He explained that I had suffered from acute digoxin toxicity. The levels in my blood were catastrophic. He told me that I was lucky to have a heart that had spent 67 years stubbornly refusing to quit, because the dose would have killed a man with a weaker constitution. It wasn't a mistake, doctor, I whispered, my voice a raspy shadow. I know exactly how many pills were in that organizer. I saw the look Henry and the doctor exchanged. Professor, you didn't just have a spell, Dr. Bellamy said. Someone invited a heart attack into your kitchen, a weak heart. That was their plan. Use the very organ that loved my daughter to stop my pulse. Henry waited until the doctor left to move closer. His voice was a rumbling baritone that barely carried past the curtain. He told me he had arrived at the lodge just as Vanessa was about to flee. She had been frozen, clutching a small glass vial, but the most chilling detail wasn't her presence. It was what she was holding. Henry revealed that Vanessa hadn't just watched me die. She was actually holding the emergency medical kit, the antidote Eleanor had prepared in the bunker. She had retrieved it, but she was too terrified of Derek's retribution to administer it. She was caught in the middle of a war, a daughter paralyzed by the monster she had married. Henry had secured the pill organizer and the remaining medication for forensic testing. He told me that Vanessa and Derek were currently at their residence, hiding behind lawyers and claiming to be too distraught to visit. It was a calculated move to avoid immediate questions they knew I would have if I ever woke up. Have you ever seen a recording of your own execution being planned? It's remarkably boring until you see the light catch the poison. She just stood there, Henry. I said the words catching in my dry throat. She didn't call 911. She just watched. Henry's eyes darkened, but he didn't offer empty platitudes. I've got the cameras running on high alert, Thane, he replied. We need to go back and see what the unblinking eyes caught. Against every bit of medical advice, Doctor Bellamy could muster, I demanded to be discharged. I couldn't stay in a bed while the man who tried to kill me was walking free. I signed the waivers with a shaky hand, the pen feeling like a lead weight. 6 hours later, I was back at the lodge, the familiar scent of cedar and wood smoke doing little to calm the storm inside me. Henry and I retreated to the surveillance room, the cold hum of the security monitors the only sound in the cramped space. We began to scrub through the footage from Derek's last visit, the one where he had pretended to offer me a $40 million buyout. We watched his every move in high definition, a pixelated ghost haunting my halls. There, I said, pointing at the screen, stop the frame. We found a 90-second gap where Derek had excused himself to the master suite. We zoomed in, the image graining but remaining clear enough to see the truth. Derek was palming a small vial. He entered the bathroom where I kept my medication, and when he exited, his face was briefly illuminated by the vanity light. He had a cold, triumphant smirk, a look of pure, predatory satisfaction. He's not even trying to hide it from the house, Henry muttered. Only from you. Derek on the screen was a parasite in a three-piece suit, finally caught in the light of the very sanctuary he wanted to burn. As we watched the footage again, we noticed something we had missed in our initial fury. Derek wasn't alone in the master suite. He was on a speakerphone call. The high-end microphones Eleanor had installed picked up a muffled voice on the other end. It was unmistakably a man's voice, sharp and demanding, giving Derek instructions on how to frame the accident. It wasn't just Derek. He was being coached, a desperate debtor taking orders from a master. I realized then that Derek wasn't the architect of this murder attempt. He was just a desperate subcontractor for someone much more powerful. The vindication was sweet, but it was tempered by a new, colder fear. I wasn't just fighting my son-in-law. I was fighting the ghosts of a gambling syndicate that viewed Timber Ridge as their ultimate prize. I watched the screen as Derek smoothed his hair and walked back to the great room, ready to play the part of the concerned family man. And I felt a righteous fury that finally burned away the last traces of the poison. The legal notice arrived before I could even finish saving the video files to the cloud. It didn't arrive with a knock or a polite request for signature. It was pinned to my heavy oak door with the cold precision of a taxidermist's needle, a white sheet of paper that screamed my own name back at me like a threat. I pulled it free, the staple leaving a jagged scar in the wood, and felt a cold tremor of realization. This was Derek's preemptive strike. I had barely stepped out of the hospital, yet he was already moving to silence me. The header of the document read, "Petition for Emergency Conservatorship." My eyes scanned the legalese, each word a poison-tipped arrow aimed at my autonomy. The entry twist hit me harder than the cardiac failure ever could. The petition wasn't just signed by Derek's high-priced firm. It was co-signed by Vanessa. My own daughter had put her name to a document alleging that I was suffering from grief-induced dementia and paranoid delusions. She was testifying in ink that my claims of being poisoned were nothing more than the hallucinations of a broken mind. I walked back into the great room, the dry, papery feel of the legal documents making my skin crawl. Henry Thorne was standing by the fireplace, the flickering orange light casting long, grim shadows across his face. I handed him the papers without a word. He read them quickly, his jaw tightening, until the muscles stood out like cords of wood. "He's calling me crazy, Henry," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the cavernous room. "He's using my grief as the weapon to take my mind. He's telling the court that I can't distinguish reality from the plots of the books I spent 40 years teaching." Henry looked up, his eyes hard and unyielding. "It's a classic play, Professor. If they can't kill the messenger, they destroy the message. He's freezing your status as trustee. Until a judge hears this, you can't sign anything, sell anything, or even use the lodge's funds to defend yourself. You're being legally paralyzed. How do you prove you're sane to a world that profits from you being broken?" I felt the walls of the lodge closing in, turning my sanctuary into a cell of Derek's making. I tried to call Sheriff Reynolds, hoping the security footage would be my shield, but the system had already been subverted. Sarah arrived at the lodge an hour later, not to collect the USB drive, but to deliver a dose of cold procedural reality. "I'm sorry, Thane," she said, her voice heavy with a frustration that matched my own. "Because this civil petition for competency was filed first, it takes precedence. Derek's lawyers have already filed a motion to stay any criminal investigation based on your testimony. They've argued that the evidence you're presenting, the video of the tampering, is tainted by your current mental instability, the lab results on your blood, and the pill organizer. They're being delayed by a discovery hold. Limbo, a religious term for a legal hell. That was my new home. I watched her depart, the distant hum of her cruiser fading into the mountain silence, and realized that Derek wasn't just playing a game of greed. He was playing a game of erasure. He didn't need to kill me with a pill anymore. He could kill me with a gavel. By evening, a second courier arrived, his engine idling at the gate like a mechanical heartbeat. He delivered the formal summons for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation. It was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning in town. I retreated to the library, the only place where I still felt like the master of my own story. I looked at the cold, smooth surface of Eleanor's silver-framed photo on the desk. She looked back at me with that knowing, tactical smile, and I felt the weight of the remaining videos pressing against my conscience. If I was declared incompetent, the videos would be dismissed as the ramblings of a sick man's wife. Derek would seize Timber Ridge immediately, and Eleanor's entire life's work would be paved over before the snow melted. I pulled the summons closer, the sharp scent of fresh ink stinging my nose. They want a hollow shell, I thought. They want a man who can't remember the truth, because the truth is too expensive for them to pay. I began to look into the doctor assigned to the evaluation, a Dr. Aris Thorne. The name didn't ring any bells until I cross-referenced it with the files Eleanor had left in the bunker. The plan reveal was chilling. Dr. Thorne wasn't a neutral party. He was the younger brother of a senior executive at Golden Peak Development, the very firm Derek was trying to sell the land to. The evaluation notice was a white flag, but not for a truce. It was the shroud Derek wanted to wrap around my legacy. This wasn't an exam. It was a pre-planned execution of my civil rights. They were going to walk me into a room, ask me questions designed to trigger my grief, and then sign the papers that would end my life as a free man. I sat in the darkness for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the library clock and the occasional pop of the dying fire. I realized then that the only way to beat a man who plays with shadows is to let the darkness swallow me whole for just long enough to strike. Derek believed he had boxed me in, that my adherence to the law and my identity as a professor would make me easy prey for his bureaucracy. He expected me to show up, defend my sanity, and lose to a rigged deck. But he didn't know that I had 52 weeks of Eleanor's genius in my pocket. He didn't know that I was finally willing to stop being the observer of tragedies and start being the architect of one. I stood up, my joints cracking in the cold air, and walked toward the dark room. I had one night to prepare. I had to face the doctor, survive the drive, and find a way to turn the light of the law back onto the parasites hiding in the corners of my family tree. The road was a ribbon of black ice and jagged mountain shadows, and for a few blissful seconds, I actually believed that my mind was the only thing Derek was trying to break today. The drive into Jackson for the psychiatric evaluation felt like a funeral procession for my own mind, a grim march toward a room where a man I had never met would hold a pen over the death certificate of my autonomy. I gripped the steering wheel of my heavy truck, the leather cold beneath my palms, and mentally rehearsed the cadence of a sane man. I would be calm. I would be articulate. I would show them that the retired professor of literature was not a victim of grief-induced dementia, but a witness to a crime. But as I began the long, winding descent into Teton Pass, the weight of Eleanor's warnings pressed against my chest. I realized then that the psychiatric evaluation was merely a lure, a way to ensure I was on the most dangerous stretch of road in Wyoming, at precisely the moment when the morning light was too thin to reveal a trap. Derek didn't just want me declared incompetent. He wanted me erased from the equation entirely. The grade increased to 10%, the truck gaining momentum, as the road curved sharply toward a sheer drop. I tapped the brakes to maintain my line, but the pedal offered no resistance. It didn't feel spongy or worn. It simply sank effortlessly to the floorboards, a hollow gesture of control in a world that had suddenly lost its friction. Nothing. No pressure. No friction. Just the floorboard meeting my boot, and the speedometer climbing toward 60. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I tried to pump the brakes, but the hydraulic system was dead, a silent conspirator in my descent. Not now, I whispered the words, freezing in the air. Focus, Thane. Pump them. I tried the emergency brake, but the cable felt slack, a useless umbilical cord severed by a master's hand. The switchbacks were coming faster now, the screech of tires on dry pavement occasionally breaking through the roar of the wind as I fought to keep the heavy vehicle from somersaulting into the ravine. With the truck gaining speed toward a sheer cliff edge, I knew I had seconds before the mountain claimed me. I made a split-second decision to ditch the vehicle into a dense snow embankment, rather than risk the drop. I swerved violently, the steering wheel bucking in my hands like a live animal as the tires screamed against the asphalt. I plowed into the packed snow at 40 miles per hour. The world exploded. There was a bone-shaking jolt of impact, followed by the deafening boom of the airbags deploying. Do you know what an airbag smells like? It smells like burnt matches and the sudden terrifying realization that you are very much alone. I was slammed into the seat, my ribs crying out, as the world turned into a blur of white nylon and choking dust. I slumped against the window, the cold wind whistling through the broken windshield, gasping for air that felt like needles. Eleanor, if this is the end, I'm sorry I couldn't finish it, I thought, the darkness of the pass threatening to swallow my consciousness as the ticking of the cooling engine became the only sound in the whiteout. I don't know how long I sat there before a passing motorist found me. By the afternoon, I was standing in a local mechanic shop in Jackson, my body a map of bruises, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. The head mechanic, a man whose skin was permanently stained with grease and whose eyes were hard with the cynical wisdom of a mountain local, wiped his hands on a rag as he gestured to the mangled undercarriage of my truck. He didn't speak with the practiced empathy of a doctor. He spoke with the blunt honesty of a man who dealt in cause and effect. This wasn't a road accident, pal, he said, his voice gravelly and low. Someone gave you a one-way ticket off this mountain. He pointed to the brake lines. They hadn't rusted through and they hadn't been nicked by road debris. They had been severed with a precision-cutting tool, and the hydraulic fluid had been completely drained away. The cut in the brake line was as clean as a surgeon's incision, a clinical ending to a life Derek deemed redundant. I felt a cold, calculated fury settle into my marrow, replacing the panic of the descent. Derek hadn't just sabotaged the truck. He had orchestrated a performance of my own death. The mechanic reached into the undercarriage and pulled out something small, a slip of plastic that had been caught in the crossmember. He handed it to me with a puzzled frown. It was a Boise hotel valet tag dated 3 days ago. The saboteur hadn't just appeared at the lodge. They had followed me from the airport, or had been watching me for weeks, perhaps even staying in the same hotels where Derek's boardroom meetings were supposedly taking place. As the mechanic handed me the severed line, my phone buzzed with a call from Sheriff Reynolds. She didn't ask if I was okay. She only said, "Derek has an alibi, Thane. He's been in a Boise boardroom for the last 6 hours." I looked at the grease on my hands and the valet tag in my palm, realizing that I was fighting a man who could be in 2 places at once while I was barely hanging on to my own life. "I need to call the sheriff back." I told the mechanic, my voice steady and cold, but not to talk about alibis. I need her to see exactly what a precision cut looks like when it's meant to be a murder. The knock at the cabin door wasn't the rhythmic sound of a visitor. It was the frantic, uneven hammering of someone who had run out of places to hide. The walk from the mechanic's shop to the sheriff's station had been a grueling 3 blocks each step, sending a fresh spike of pain through my cracked ribs. But this sound was a different kind of trauma. I had retreated to Henry's cabin to recover, seeking the relative safety of the shadows, yet the world refused to leave me in peace. I moved toward the door, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker by the wood stove. I pulled the heavy timber back, and for a moment the freezing rain of the Tetons blurred my vision. Then I saw her. Vanessa stood there, her designer clothes soaked through and clinging to her trembling frame, her face a mask of pure terror. She didn't wait for an invitation. She practically fell into the room, her eyes darting back toward the dark tree line, as if she expected Derek to emerge from the blackness like a vengeful spirit. Inside, the hiss of the wood stove was the only sound as I guided her to a chair. She was hyperventilating, her cold, pale hands shaking so violently she couldn't even unbutton her coat. How do you look at your child and see both the victim and the villain in the same trembling pair of eyes? I wrapped a wool blanket around her, watching as the warmth of the cabin slowly began to thaw her exterior, though I knew the frost inside her ran much deeper. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. "He's going to kill you. I tried to stop him. I tried to talk him down, but he's past listening. He's gone somewhere dark, and I can't stop him anymore." I sat across from her, my own body aching, but my mind sharpening with a cold clarity. "You're safe here, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But if we are going to survive this, I need the truth. I need all of it. No more half measures, and no more of the lies Derek fed you." She looked at me then, and the entry twist surfaced from the depths of her guilt. She confessed that Derek didn't just find the records he used to blackmail her. He had actually encouraged her to drink that night back in 2020. He knew she was emotionally fragile, mourning a failed project, and he had poured the drinks himself, waiting for her to make the mistake he needed to own her forever. Vanessa's voice dropped as she began the long descent into the details of the embezzlement trap. Her descent had truly begun in 2019 when she stole $600,000 from a medical device company to cover Derek's spiraling gambling losses. $600,000. A lifetime of my salary vanished in a single secret transaction to keep my daughter out of a jumpsuit. She revealed that Eleanor had found out and paid the full restitution in secret to save Vanessa from a felony conviction. It was a staggering revelation of my wife's hidden life. Eleanor had been a silent financier of our daughter's survival, while I remained blissfully unaware. However, Derek had been one step ahead. He had kept copies of the original incriminating documents, using them as a leash to force Vanessa into signing the competency petition against me. "He made me choose between my freedom and your mind, Dad," she sobbed. "He told me that if I didn't help him, he'd send the files to the feds himself." The confession took a darker, more jagged turn as she spoke of the 2020 hit and run. She had been driving drunk, fueled by Derek's encouragement, when she struck a 19-year-old athlete named Michael Torres. The impact had been sickening, a memory that clearly haunted her every waking hour. Eleanor didn't just settle the case. She had paid a $50,000 private settlement and used her influence to bury the police report. Derek had found the records of this blood money in Eleanor's files, after she died, using the threat of a vehicular assault charge to turn Vanessa into his unwilling accomplice. "His name is Michael Torres," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "He can't walk without a cane because of me. Your mother didn't just protect you, Vanessa," I said, the weight of the secret nearly crushing me. "She built a cage of secrets to keep you safe, and Derek just walked in and took the keys. The truth wasn't setting us free. It was a floodgate that had finally burst, drowning the memory of the woman I thought Eleanor was." I felt an ethical crisis blooming in the center of my chest, a sharp contrast to the physical pain of my ribs. The plan reveal that followed was the final blow to my understanding of the local law. Vanessa revealed that the contact who helped Eleanor bury the hit-and-run report wasn't some high-priced fixer. It was a young deputy who had been first on the scene, a woman who was now sheriff, Sarah Reynolds. The very woman I had been leaning on for protection was the one who had helped hide my daughter's crime. It was a cycle of debt and silence that Derek had mapped out with predatory precision. I realized then that the alibi Derek had in Boise wasn't just a convenience. It was a shield provided by a system he had thoroughly compromised. Vanessa reached into her bag, her fingers fumbling with a small, blood-stained digital recorder. "I didn't just come to talk, Dad," she said, her voice regaining a sliver of strength. "I came to show you what he's planning for Eagle Peak. He thinks I'm still on his side, but he's wrong. He's been talking to someone high up, and I caught it." I stared at the device in her hand, the metallic click of the power button sounding like the cocking of a hammer in the quiet cabin. My daughter had handed me the one weapon Derek wouldn't expect me to have. As she pressed play, the static hissed, and a voice I had come to loathe filled the room, cold and calculating. Vanessa looked at me with a silent plea for forgiveness, but I was already looking past her, toward the ridge where the lynx were hiding and where my son was waiting. The end game had begun. The grainy audio on the recorder hissed with the sound of a mountain wind, but Derek's voice cut through the static like a serrated blade, outlining the exact coordinates of my intended grave. The audio on the recorder was distorted by the sound of a running engine, but Derek's voice was unmistakable, devoid of the oily charm he used to mask his greed. He was speaking to a man he called the Handler, giving specific instructions on how to stage my disappearance on Eagle Peak. I sat in Henry's cabin, the heat of the wood stove, failing to reach the ice in my marrow. Vanessa sat across from me, her face ghostly and pale, watching me listen to her husband coordinate my murder. Every word from the speaker was a nail in the coffin of our family, as I once knew it. I realized that the alibi in Boise was just a distraction. Derek had a team in place, shadows moving across my land at his command. I looked at the small blood-stained device in my hand and felt a sudden sharp clarity. The time for being the passive literature professor was over. My wife had left me a fortress, and it was time I learned how to command it. I stood up and walked to the small safe in the corner of the cabin where I had stored the items from the bunker. I retrieved a sealed envelope Eleanor had marked with a simple, devastating instruction, "When you're ready." I handed it to Vanessa. "Your mother knew this day would come." I told her, my voice low and steady. "She knew you were caught in a trap, and she spent her final strength building you a way out." Vanessa's hands trembled as she broke the seal. As she read Eleanor's plea for her to choose the truth over Derek's cage, the armor of her anxiety finally began to shatter. Eleanor's letter revealed a final staggering act of tactical love. The $50,000 settlement to Michael Torres hadn't just been hush money to bury the report. Eleanor had used that money to fund a specific trust for Michael's medical care, and future a trust that the boy could only access if Vanessa formally confessed her role in the hit and run. Eleanor wasn't just buying silence. She was buying Vanessa's eventual redemption. "Confession is a heavy price," I said, watching my daughter's face, but silence was the currency Derek used to buy my life. "Confession isn't a sentence, Vanessa. It's the only way to stop Derek from using your past to kill our future." I watched the genuine healing grief finally break through her terror. a daughter returning to herself through the words of a mother who had never given up on her. Confession is a heavy price, but silence was the currency Derek used to buy my life. We returned to the lodge under the cover of a gray, overcast dawn, moving like shadows through the fresh, pine-scented air. The transition from the isolation of Henry's cabin to the activity at the lodge was jarring. We were met at the gates by a convoy of rugged trucks, loaded with scientific equipment, their tires crunching over the frozen gravel. My son Ethan led the charge, his University of Montana research team, transforming the sanctuary into a high-tech fortress of science in a matter of hours. The research trucks were like steel knights arriving on a battlefield of snow, their flashing light bars the first sign of a law Derek couldn't manipulate. Ethan immediately began coordinating the deployment of DNA hair traps and high-speed infrared cameras across the western ridge. The lodge, once a target of silent sabotage, was now swarming with witnesses and professionals. If the feds see a mother lynx on this feed, Derek's developer friends will run for the hills, Ethan said, checking his tablet as he directed a grad student. We're not just tracking a cat anymore, Ethan, I replied, looking toward the ridgeline. We're tracking a predator in a suit. By afternoon, I found myself in the newly established ecology lab, watching the blue-white glare of the computer monitors as the team synced the forest sensors to our central server. The hum of high-speed server fans filled the room, a mechanical heartbeat for the new timber ridge. I watched the map of the property come alive with digital eyes, each sensor a sentinel Eleanor had anticipated I would need. She didn't just buy land, I realized. She selected a site where geography and federal law would eventually collide to protect me. She had built a biological firewall that was currently being activated by our sons and our allies. Ethan revealed that the DNA samples from the previous week's tracks had already been prioritized for sequencing at the university. They had confirmed the presence of a pure strain Canada lynx, an endangered subspecies that carried the weight of the Endangered Species Act like a shield over our heads. It was a masterpiece of legal and biological planning, and I was finally seeing the brushstrokes of my wife's genius. How many layers did Eleanor's plan have? I was beginning to feel like I was reading a masterpiece where the ending was written in invisible ink. I assisted the team with the calibration of the infrared feeds, the tactile weight of Eleanor's final letter, still a presence in my pocket. The room was bathed in the cool light of the monitors, and the smell of fresh rain and wet pine clung to the researchers' jackets. It's time to light the match and see who tries to run, told Ethan. He looked at me, seeing a version of his father that had replaced academic reflection with a gravely determined resolve. Just as the final feed from the western ridge came online, a high-pitched ping echoed through the lab. One of Ethan's grad students, a man named Marcus who moved with a tactical precision that didn't match his academic title, leaned in close. Marcus was actually an undercover U.S. Fish and Wildlife Special Agent Eleanor had been corresponding with for a year before her death. He looked at me with a sharp, knowing gaze. Ethan looked up from his monitor, his face pale in the blue LED glow. "Dad, we just got a ping from the ridge," he whispered. "Something is moving toward the den, and it isn't Selena." The infrared footage was grainy, a world of black and gray shadows dancing on the edge of the ridge, but the way the intruder moved, deliberate, heavy, and holding something long and metallic, was unmistakably human. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue LED glow washing over my face. We sat in a tense, breathless silence in the ecology lab, a high-tech nerve center carved out of the mountain's silence. Henry Thorne and Ethan stood behind me, their eyes fixed on the heat signature encroaching upon the ridge. Vanessa was there too, her face pale, watching the screen, as if she could see the ghost of her own past moving through the trees. The intruder reached the rocky outcrop, the specific coordinates Eleanor had protected for years. Just as the figure raised the metallic object, a second heat signature erupted from the darkness of a nearby crevice. Selena, the mother lynx, emerged like a wraith, her frame nearly twice the size of a bobcat on the thermal red. She didn't attack, but her presence was a physical wall of natural fury. The intruder froze, and in that moment, the high-definition cameras Ethan's team had mounted captured the biological jackpot. 3 smaller Heat Blossoms kittens spilled out from the den, their rhythmic thumping, as they tumbled over one another, visible in the clear resolution of the night vision feed. "We got them." Dad Ethan whispered, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and triumph. "Every single one of them is on record now. That footage is Derek's death warrant, not for his life, but for his greed. Beautiful, deadly, and worth $60 million in legal protection." Selena wasn't just a cat. She was a sovereign state. Ethan tapped a few keys, expanding the view to show the intruder's abandoned gear. He revealed that the saboteur caught on camera wasn't a poacher at all, but a specialized technician Derek had hired to plant false evidence of a chemical spill. The long metallic object was a pressurized canister designed to contaminate the soil, a desperate attempt to invalidate the sanctuary's conservation status. Derek was trying to poison the land because he couldn't poison me. I felt a surge of extreme vindication, a sharp, cold heat in my chest that had nothing to do with the heart problems that nearly killed me. This wasn't just a win for the Lynx. It was the final, undeniable proof of a conspiracy that reached from the boardroom to the mud. Vanessa looked at the screen, and then at me, her eyes wet with the realization that the man she had loved was prepared to destroy an entire species just to cover his gambling debts. The following morning, the phone in the lodge library rang its chime, sounding like a warning bell. I picked it up, feeling the smooth, cool surface of my desk beneath my hand. It was Derek. His tone had undergone a jarring transformation, the corporate aggression replaced by an oily, forced humility that made my skin crawl. "Thane, I've been thinking," he said, and I could hear the raspy hiss of his breathing through the receiver. "Life is too short for this bitterness. I was wrong about the property. I've been doing some reading on conservation, and I think I finally understand what Eleanor was trying to do. I found my way back to family values. Let's talk just us. Have you ever heard a man apologize for trying to kill you while you knew he was still holding the knife behind his back?" I took a sip of bitter tea, the liquid stinging my tongue as I looked at the silver-framed photo of my wife. "I'm tired, Derek," I said, layering my voice with a veneer of elderly exhaustion I didn't truly feel. "Maybe it is time we found common ground. Perhaps the lawyers have done enough damage." Derek's response was immediate, a predator sensing a weakness in the herd. He proposed a bonding hike to Eagle Peak for the coming Saturday. He wanted us to go to the highest point on the property, away from the sensors and the lawyers, so we could discuss a peaceful compromise. I recognized the scenario immediately. It was the exact pivot Eleanor had predicted in her final video, the Week 52 warning. She had told me that when Derek ran out of legal and chemical options, he would try to isolate me. He wanted the mountain, and he was inviting me to my own execution. "Let's go up to Eagle Peak." "Saturday morning," Derek said, his voice dropping into a register of fake sincerity. Like a father and son should. "Saturday." Then I replied, my eyes meeting Henry's as he walked into the room. "I'll meet you at the trailhead." I hung up the phone, the smell of old leather in the library seeming more pronounced in the sudden quiet. Derek's voice on the phone was like sugar-coated arsenic. Sweet on the tongue, but I could already feel the poison in the air. I looked at Henry, who was already checking the batteries on the hidden recorders Ethan's team had provided. He didn't need me to explain the danger. He had been a ranger long enough to know when a man was being led to a slaughterhouse. But I had a secret Derek hadn't accounted for. While preparing my legal files earlier, I had discovered that Derek had already taken out a massive life insurance policy on me through one of his shell companies, naming the company as the sole beneficiary. It was the final proof I needed that the hike wasn't about compromise. It was about a payout that would save his skin from the gambling syndicates. The man wasn't just greedy. He was a desperate subcontractor for death. "He wants the mountain," I told Henry, my voice calm and analytical, a reflection of the man Eleanor knew I could become. Let's give it to him. I felt a cold, tactical determination take hold. I wasn't going to that peak as a victim. I was going as the bait for a trap that Eleanor had been setting for 24 years. The endgame had officially begun, and I was finally ready to play my part. I looked at the monitors one last time, seeing Selena watching over her kittens. And I knew that whatever happened on that summit, the mountain would remember the truth. The steel door of the bunker groaned as I pulled it open, a sound like a physical ache echoing through the studio, signaling that the time for hiding was officially over. The combination 091545 felt like a prayer as I punched it into the bunker's keypad for what I hoped would be the last time. I descended into the cool, recirculated air of the vault, the weight of the upcoming confrontation sitting heavy in my gut. As the lights hummed to life, I realized that the bunker isn't just an archive. It's a hardened command center. Tucked behind the medical refrigerator was a secondary satellite uplink, its status lights glowing a steady, defiant green. Eleanor had known that Derek might try to jam local signals, so she had built a digital bridge that his reach couldn't touch. I sat at the desk, the smell of ozone from the server racks sharp in my nostrils, and began to pull the final files from the secure cabinet. The dry texture of the property appraisals beneath my fingertips told a story of wealth that I had never imagined. I spent the better part of the night reviewing those finalized documents. The $60 million truth was staring me in the face, typed in a cold, professional font. I realized the property's true value isn't the timber or the sprawling views. It was the senior headwater rights and the non-invasive genetics research rights for the Canada Lynx corridor. Collectively, they were worth over $60 million. This revelation made Derek's initial $28 million offer look like a petty theft, a lowball scam designed to exploit a grieving widower. You were never just a photographer, Eleanor, I thought. You were a master architect of assets. She had seen the convergence of ecology and law long before I had even considered leaving Chicago. $60 million. In the world of literature, that's a tragedy. In the world of Derek Brooks, it's a reason to kill. It confirmed the magnitude of the greed I was fighting, a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied with anything less than my total destruction. I moved to a secondary file, one hidden beneath the land deeds. It documented the lethal collusion between Derek's gambling debts and the board of Golden Peak Development. I discovered that the executives Derek had been dealing with were actually fronts for the very casino enforcers who had been threatening his life for years. He hadn't just invited a developer into our lives. He had invited a cartel. He had essentially sold the family's future and the sanctity of the mountain just to stay out of a concrete jacket. Every step Derek took toward me was being dictated by men who viewed a human life as a line item on a ledger. The upcoming hike wasn't just a familial dispute. It was a matter of survival for everyone involved, including Vanessa. I felt a cold, sharp clarity regarding the stakes. I was no longer just protecting a house. I was standing in the gap between a criminal syndicate and the legacy of the woman I loved. How do you agree to be the bait in a trap when you know the predator has already tried to stop your heart twice? I turned to the laptop and opened the final video file, marked Week 52, Emergency Use Only. Eleanor appeared on the screen, her face gaunt and her voice a mere rasp, yet her eyes were burning with a fierce, tactical determination. She didn't offer comfort this time. She gave orders. She explained that Derek's arrogance is his greatest weakness, a blind spot we had to exploit. Thane, you must be the bait. She whispered, the flickering blue light of the video casting long shadows against the bunker walls. Let him believe he's won until the moment the handcuffs click. She instructed me to specifically reveal my knowledge of the bunker to Derek, to dangle the secret in front of him until he was provoked into a violent, provable reaction. She emphasized that the sheriff must be the silent witness to this final act, the one person who could turn Derek's desperation into a life sentence. Eleanor's final words were a lighthouse in the middle of a hurricane. They didn't stop the storm, but they gave me a direction to steer. I trust you to finish this, she said, her image beginning to grain as the recording reached its end. Protect our land. Protect our daughter. I love you. The screen went black, leaving me in the silence of the command center. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the satellite uplink the only sound in the room. I reached into the safe one last time and found a digital recording I hadn't seen before. It was Derek's nuclear option. Years ago, Eleanor had recorded him confessing to his early deaths on a hidden nursery monitor, while he thought he was alone with a sleeping baby. She had kept it for this exact moment, a final blade to slide between his ribs if he ever turned on us. It was the ultimate character exposure, a recording of the man Derek truly was before the Italian suits and the corporate facade. I closed the laptop, my heart steady for the first time in months. I looked at the small black briefcase Eleanor had left beside the desk, tucked into a corner where it wouldn't be seen by a casual observer. I reached down and clicked the latches. Inside was the one thing Derek would never expect a retired professor to carry: a high-gain directional microphone and a set of encrypted body wires linked directly to the satellite uplink upstairs. Eleanor had provided the tools for me to record my own potential murder in real time, ensuring that even if I didn't make it off the mountain, the truth would. I packed the equipment with practiced care, feeling the weight of the $60 million plan settle into my shoulders. I was the bait, but I was bait with teeth. I climbed the stairs out of the bunker, the morning light of day 71 beginning to bleed through the studio windows. I had a meeting at the diner to catch the first phase of a plan that would either save my family or bury me under the weight of the Teton Range. The bell above the diner door chimed with a cheerful irony that made my skin crawl, announcing my arrival to the man who had already tried to bury me 3 times. The Mountain View diner was filled with the smell of cheap grease-burnt coffee and maple syrup, a mundane backdrop for the execution of a $60 million plan. I clutched the small black briefcase, tightly feeling the hum of the electronics within. Derek was already seated in a corner booth, looking like the picture of a repentant family man in a soft cashmere sweater. He stood as I approached, offering a hand I had no intention of taking. "Thane, thanks for coming," he said, his voice reaching for a warmth that didn't exist. I ignored the gesture and sat across from him, the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock behind the counter, counting down the seconds of our final civility. "You're late, Derek," I said, my voice as cold as the frost on the windows. Desperation usually makes a man more punctual. He tried to laugh it off, beginning a rehearsed monologue about family values and moving past the legal misunderstandings of the last few months. I didn't let him finish. I reached into my coat and placed a single laminated page on the sticky table, a copy of the finalized $60 million appraisal from Eleanor's bunker. I watched his eyes widen, a mixture of predatory hunger and sheer panic flickering across his face like heat lightning. $60 million. That's not a retirement, Derek. That's a motive. I leaned forward, watching him scramble for a retort. $60 million, he stammered. "Thane, you're reading those charts wrong. It's dirt and rock." "No," I replied. "It's senior headwater rights and a biological corridor protected by the federal government. And I know about the cartel enforcers you've been calling executives." I revealed a power reversal that made the color drain from his lips. I had already signed a temporary power of attorney over to Ethan. Even if I died on our scheduled hike, Derek would still get nothing but a police interrogation. The man across from me wasn't just greedy anymore. He was a cornered animal, realizing the cage was shrinking. I continued to goad him, the psychological dominance shifting entirely into my camp. I told him I had found the bunker and documented every one of his accidents, from the propane leak to the brake lines. I implied that the evidence was already in a digital dead man's switch set to be released to the feds, unless he explained his true motives during our walk to Eagle Peak. Derek's hands began to shake so violently he had to grip his coffee mug with both palms to keep from spilling it. The nice guy mask finally crumbled, leaving only the rabid, desperate debtor beneath. "I know about the Boise alibi, Derek," I whispered. "And I know who you were talking to in my bathroom." He looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. "See you on the trail, Professor." He hissed, his voice a low snarl. "I hope your heart can handle the altitude." I stood up and walked out, the briefcase in my hand, acting as a high-frequency jammer that ensured Derek couldn't record our conversation or call his handlers for reinforcements before I left the premises. Do you know the difference between a predator and prey? It's not the teeth. It's who knows where the traps are buried. I drove to the secluded trailhead, where Sheriff Reynolds was waiting in an unmarked SUV. The weight of the upcoming ascent sat heavy on my cracked ribs, but Eleanor's tactical ghost was guiding every step I took. Ethan was there too, his face a mask of terror for my safety, while Margaret Caldwell stood by with a stack of final injunctions. Before I expose the truth behind the Boise alibi, if you are still with me, comment A if you think I should trust the wire, or B if I should carry a weapon, and add one short reason. Please note, the next part contains fictionalized details to deepen the drama, though the message remains true. If this crosses your line, feel free to stop here. Wiring the bait was a clinical, silent process. Reynolds led me into the back of the vehicle, the air inside smelling of leather and gun oil. The wire against my skin was a cold, silver snake, the only thing that would tell the truth if my voice was silenced on that mountain. She used a cold adhesive to secure the transmitter to my chest, then fitted a state-of-the-art camera disguised as a jacket button. A wrist-mounted panic device was hidden under my sleeve, its surface smooth and ominous. Ethan gripped my shoulder, his hand trembling. "If he touches you, Thane, you hit that button." Sarah ordered, her eyes locked on mine. "Don't wait for a confession. If he moves aggressively, we move in." I shook my head, my resolve hardening into something brittle and sharp. "I need him to speak, Sarah. I need him to tell the recorder why he did it. I need him to admit the cartel's involvement. Without that, the sanctuary is never truly safe." We finalized the tactical plan in hushed tones, the sound of heavy static in my earpiece, a constant reminder of the technological net we were weaving. The deputies would remain in the tree line, leapfrogging behind us as we climbed. They would be invisible, but they would be listening to every breath I took. Margaret reminded me that legally this was my only chance to sever Derek from the estate once and for all under the moral turpitude clause. The metallic taste of fear was sharp on my tongue, but I swallowed it down, thinking of Eleanor and the lynx she had died to protect. Reynolds checked the feed on her tablet and nodded, the blue light reflecting in her weary eyes. "We can hear everything, Thane. Now go up there and make him say it." The first step onto the Eagle Peak Trail felt like crossing a threshold into a world where oxygen was a luxury, and my son-in-law was the only judge of who deserved to breathe it. The morning of the hike was a world of gray light and bone-chilling silence, the kind of stillness that precedes a landslide. I met Derek at the trailhead at 6 a.m. sharp. He looked ready for a catalog shoot in high-end technical gear, while I felt every bit of my 67 years beneath my layers. The thin, freezing air burned my lungs as we began the grueling 3-mile climb. For the first hour, Derek maintained a mask of forced camaraderie, talking about the view and the fresh start we were all embarking on. I remained quiet, focusing on the steady, rhythmic beat of my heart and the hidden weight of the wire against my chest. I was waiting for the altitude to strip away his patience, for the physical strain to compromise his carefully constructed persona. As the trail narrowed and the cliff edges became more pronounced, his tone shifted. The friendly banter was replaced by subtle intimidation, little comments about how easy it would be for an old man to lose his footing on the scree slopes. "Just keep your head down, Thane," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's a long way to the top." I glanced at him, my gaze steady despite the fatigue. "I've spent 40 years teaching men how to fall in literature, Derek. I think I can handle a hike." We reached the 2-mile mark, a place where the ridge dropped sharply into a 1,000-foot ravine. The wind howled through the gap, a mournful sound that seemed to highlight the isolation. I stopped, leaning against a frost-covered boulder. It was time. I looked Derek in the eye, and revealed that I had found the hidden bunker, Eleanor's journal, and the recorded phone calls regarding his casino enforcers. I watched the color drain from his face, replaced by a twitch near his left eye. I mentioned the entry twist I had uncovered, the second pair of gloves he had stashed in his pack, to plant on my body, to make a murder look like a suicide induced by my mental decline. "Why didn't you just wait, Derek?" I asked. "Why not let nature take its course?" He finally snapped. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered, his face contorted with a sociopathic rage that made him look like a stranger. "Because you're too healthy, Thane," he roared, his voice echoing off the granite walls. "You'd live 20 years while I rot in a basement, or end up at the bottom of a lake. Those people won't wait another month. You have to go today." The mountain didn't care about our morality. It was just a giant of stone and ice waiting to see which one of us would become part of its debris. Then he lunged. No more words. No more Italian suits or cashmere dreams. Just a man trying to trade my life for his debt. He shoved me toward the precipice with a desperate, frantic strength. I stumbled back, the grit of the ridgestone scraping beneath my boots, and I felt my heel catch on a loose rock. As I began to tilt toward the void, I hit the panic button on my wrist. Derek loomed over me, reaching out for a second blow to ensure I went over the edge. "It'll just be another accident in the snow," he screamed, his eyes wide with a terrifying vacancy. But before he could touch me again, the tree line erupted. Ethan and the undercover deputies burst from the shadows with guns drawn, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the white wasteland. "Get your hands off my father," Ethan's voice was a thunderclap in the thin air. The recording device beneath my jacket captured every sound, the scuffle, the guttural roar of Derek's rage, and the sickening thud as he was forced into the dirt. Have you ever felt the breath of death on your neck and realized it smelled like cheap bourbon and overpriced cologne? I lay on the edge of the ridge, gasping for air, watching as Derek struggled against the deputies. He tried to claim entrapment, his voice shrill and desperate as he spat dirt from his mouth, but the system had finally caught up to him. Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward, her face set in a line of weary triumph. She revealed the final exit twist. A secondary drone feed had been hovering high above us, recording every second of the physical assault in crystal-clear resolution. The delusional old man defense was dead. Derek was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a recorded predator. The grit of the ridgestone was still under my fingernails, as I allowed Ethan to pull me up, my cracked ribs screaming at the movement. But the pain was a secondary concern to the profound relief washing over me. As the sun began to set, the mountain face was bathed in a brilliant, cruel orange glow. The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut on Derek's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 24 years. He looked back at me as he was dragged down the trail, his eyes promising a vengeance he no longer had the power to enact. He was a hollow man, a parasite finally removed from the host. I stood on the peak, watching the orange light fade into purple shadows, and felt the presence of Eleanor in the wind. We had done it. The sanctuary was safe, and the secret that had almost destroyed our daughter was finally out in the light where it could be dismantled. The walk back down the mountain was longer than the ascent, but for the first time in months, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I was Thane Garrison, a retired professor, a father, and the sovereign protector of Timber Ridge. I took one last breath of the cold mountain air, realizing that while I had spent my life teaching stories, I had finally finished the one that mattered most. The silence that returned to Eagle Peak wasn't the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. It was the heavy, echoing hush of a courtroom before the gavel falls. As I watched the sheriff's cruiser disappear down the mountain with Derek in the back, I felt a strange, cold numbness where the adrenaline had been. The walk back down the mountain was longer than the ascent, but for the first time in months, I didn't have to look over my shoulder. My ribs still ached with every breath, a physical reminder of the collision Derek had orchestrated. But the weight on my soul had finally begun to lift. I spent the next 48 hours coordinating with Margaret Caldwell and Ethan, preparing for the legal storm that was about to break. Sheriff Reynolds didn't waste a second. She executed simultaneous search warrants on Derek's home and his private real estate office, and what they found was a digital archive of malice that made my blood run cold. They recovered an encrypted laptop containing deleted drafts of a document titled The Old Man's Final Days. It was a meticulous roadmap for framing my dementia, detailing how to isolate me, swap my medications, and provoke outbursts in public. Deleted files are never truly gone. They're just ghosts waiting for the right digital medium to haunt the person who typed them. More chillingly, the digital paper trail led to a series of untraceable payments made to the technician we'd caught on the Lynx cameras. Derek hadn't just wanted my money, Sheriff Reynolds told me as she showed me the evidence at the station. He wanted to rewrite your medical history while you were still alive. He wanted to erase Thane Garrison so he could inhabit his legacy. Literature is full of villains who try to play God with other people's lives, I replied, staring at the screen. Derek just lacked the imagination to succeed. The most horrifying discovery was a hidden plan reveal. Derek had actually planned to kill Vanessa as well once the property transfer was complete, fearing she would eventually crack under the guilt and turn on him. Vanessa sat with me and Margaret Caldwell in the lodge library a few days later, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows over her weary face. She was ready to face the consequences Eleanor had tried so hard to spare her from. With a trembling hand, she signed a formal confession detailing her medical embezzlement and the 2020 hit and run of Michael Torres. Do you know what the hardest part of forgiveness is? It's not letting the other person off the hook. It's watching your own child put the handcuffs on themselves. She took full responsibility for her initial crimes, agreeing to testify against Derek in exchange for a plea bargain that included significant restitution and community service. "I'm ready to stop running, Dad," she whispered, the smell of fresh rain and wet pine clinging to her sweater. "I want Michael to have the justice Mom tried to buy for me. Truth is a heavy anchor, Vanessa," I told her, placing a hand on hers. "But it's the only thing that will keep you from drifting back into Derek's reach." The trial of the people versus Derek Brooks began on a cold, sterile Tuesday in April. The county courthouse was filled with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of suppressed anticipation. The prosecution's case was airtight, fueled by the drone footage and my own recorded confession from the mountain. Derek's legal team tried to argue entrapment, claiming I had goaded him into a state of mental distress, but the presentation of Eleanor's Week 52 video destroyed his remaining credibility. Hearing her voice in that courtroom presented as a dying declaration was the most powerful moment of my life. It was as if she were standing there with us, her eyes sharp and her resolve unyielding. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the silence was absolute. Guilty on all counts, including 2 counts of attempted murder. Derek didn't take the verdict with dignity. He lunged toward the railing, his face a mask of sociopathic rage. "You're a meddling old man, Thane," he roared, his voice echoing in the rafters. "You'll die in that house alone." I looked at him with a calm that seemed to infuriate him further. "I'm never alone, Derek," I said. "I have the truth. You have 4 walls and a memory of what you lost." The judge's gavel sounded like the final period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in a maximum security facility, ensuring he would never again see the sun rise over the Teton Range. As he was let out in chains, a final power reversal was triggered. The moral turpitude clause Eleanor had inserted into the trust was activated by the felony conviction. Derek's potential spousal share of any future inheritance was automatically redirected into a permanent medical trust for Michael Torres's rehabilitation. Eleanor had ensured that the man who tried to profit from her family would instead fund the healing of the boy her daughter had hurt. As the courtroom cleared, the cold, sterile lighting seemed a bit warmer. Vanessa sat in the front row, her muffled sobbing the only sound in the wake of the sentence. I walked to her and held her, feeling her breathe for the first time in years, without the weight of Derek's thumb on her neck. Margaret Caldwell approached us, handing me a heavy legal brief. The land was safe. The critical habitat designation was in process, and the development permits for Golden Peak were being permanently revoked by the federal government. But as I flipped through the final pages of the brief, I realized the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had one more surprise for the Garrison family. I looked at the seal on the document and felt a surge of somber vindication. Eleanor hadn't just saved the land, she had ensured it would become a world-class center for the very species she loved. As Derek was led into the transport van outside, I knew our part in the tragedy was over. I looked at the legal brief one more time, a sense of deep peace settling over me. We were no longer the hunted. We were the guardians. The official letter from the Department of the Interior arrived with an embossed seal that didn't just protect the land. It permanently silenced the jackhammers Derek had tried to invite into our woods. I held the heavy, crisp paper in the great room of the lodge, the late spring sun bleeding through the high windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Ethan stood beside me, his face glowing with a deep professional and personal pride that seemed to mirror my own. We reviewed the formal report together, our eyes tracing the words that officially designated Timber Ridge as a critical habitat for the Canada lynx. This wasn't just a win for the environment. It was a total legal shutdown of Derek's vision for a high-density resort. The land was now sovereign. I realized that Eleanor's foresight had secured the sanctuary's future for decades to come, especially when Ethan mentioned the massive $15 million partnership offer from Terragen Bio. They weren't interested in timber or views. They wanted to fund non-invasive genetics research. "The land is sovereign now," Dad Ethan said, his voice steady with conviction. "Not even the biggest developer in the state can move a rock here." I nodded, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "Eleanor didn't just save a species," I replied. "She ensured we could afford to protect it. Critical habitat." In the eyes of the law, a few cats were more powerful than $1 billion development board. I loved the irony. As I dug deeper into the Terragen offer, I uncovered another layer of my wife's genius. Their interest wasn't some lucky coincidence. Eleanor had been a primary shareholder in a shell company that helped fund their early research years ago, specifically to ensure they would be the stable, conservation-minded partner Timber Ridge would eventually need. She had handpicked our allies from the grave. 4 months passed in a blur of lab construction and ecological surveys. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint became the new scent of the lodge. By August, it was time for Vanessa's release. She had earned an early exit through good behavior and her absolute cooperation in dismantling Derek's network of enforcers. I met her at the Jackson Community Center for the final handover of her court-ordered restitution. Michael Torres, a young man with a resilience that hummed beneath his quiet exterior, leaned on a dark wood cane as he met my daughter's gaze, his eyes devoid of the bitterness I expected. "Have you ever seen a debt paid in person? It doesn't look like a transaction. It looks like a person finally standing up straight." Vanessa handed him the $5,000 check with hands that no longer shook. "This doesn't fix your leg, Michael," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But I hope it starts to fix the lie I lived." Michael looked at the check and then at her, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "It's a start, Vanessa. A real one." Later that afternoon, as Michael and I sat on a bench outside, he dropped a final bombshell. He revealed that he had actually known about the $50,000 blood money Eleanor had sent him years ago. He had refused to spend a cent of it, keeping it in a separate savings account all this time. He offered to donate the entire sum back to the sanctuary. It was a gesture of integrity that made the air feel cleaner, a sign that the cycle of secrecy had finally been broken by a young man who valued the truth more than a payout. Vanessa returned to the lodge that evening, stepping onto the porch with the hesitant gait of a stranger. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of wet pine and the distant, sharp cry of a hawk. I gave her a tour of the new lab, showing her where the data from the mountain sensors was processed. She looked at the monitors, watching the live feeds of the forest she had almost helped destroy. Eventually, I led her to Eleanor's studio. I reached into the safe and pulled out the final envelope. Eleanor's check was more than currency. It was a bridge she'd built across the chasm of her own daughter's mistakes. I handed it to her along with the note. Inside was a $10,000 check and a few simple words. Second chances require resources. Vanessa collapsed into the chair, the crinkle of the handwritten note loud in the quiet room. She broke down into a fit of overwhelming grace and healing grief. She knew I'd lose everything, didn't she? Vanessa sobbed, clutching the paper to her chest. I sat on the edge of the desk, watching the sunset catch the ridges of the Tetons. She knew you'd find yourself, Vanessa, I said. She just wanted to make sure you had the tools to build something new. We sat in the studio for a long time, the silence between us no longer filled with the ghosts of Derek's threats. I felt a sense of completion, a feeling that the narrative I had been thrust into on that cold January afternoon was finally reaching its intended resolution. My daughter was home. My son was leading a scientific revolution on our own soil, and the man who tried to kill us was a memory fading behind prison bars. I looked at the silver-framed photo of Eleanor on the desk. Her architectural script on the note was the last piece of her physical presence I had left to discover. I realized that my role as a literature professor had prepared me for many things, but it was Eleanor who had taught me the most important lesson of all, that a well-plotted life isn't about avoiding tragedy, but about building a sanctuary strong enough to survive it. As Vanessa clutched the note, the sound of a vehicle approaching made us both tense, a reflexive habit we hadn't yet broken. But then the radio on the desk crackled to life, and Henry's voice was calm and steady. "Professor, the scientists are here from the university," he said, and they brought the first satellite images of the spring kittens. Vanessa looked at me, a spark of genuine hope in her eyes, and I knew the next chapter of our lives was about to begin. The air was brittle with a 15-degree chill, but the lodge glowed like a warm amber lantern against the obsidian vastness of the Wyoming night, a monument to a woman who had planned for everyone's future but her own. The grand opening of the Eleanor Garrison Wildlife Gallery was scheduled for the 15th of December, exactly 11.5 months since I had first turned that brass key in the lock. I stood in the great room adjusting my tie while the scent of expensive champagne and pine needle tea filled the air. Outside, the crunch of fresh snow underfoot announced the arrival of 80 guests, university faculty, Terragen executives, and even Sheriff Reynolds, who traded her uniform for a sharp blazer tonight. My eyes stayed on the center of the room, where the ribbon-cutting ceremony was about to transform Timber Ridge from a site of secret warfare into a world-class research center. I felt a profound sense of accomplishment as I watched Vanessa. She was leading Michael Torres through the gallery, her movements no longer jerky with anxiety, but fluid and grounded. I realized that the entry twist Eleanor had hidden was the most staggering of all. While reviewing the final video files, I discovered that the 365 days later message was actually recorded on the very first day of Eleanor's diagnosis. She hadn't just visualized this victory after building the lodge. She had seen it before a single brick was laid. She knew the man I was, a literature professor who lived through other people's chapters, and she had designed this entire odyssey to force me to write my own. How many pages must a man turn before he realizes he's no longer reading someone else's book? But writing the final chapter of his own, I watched with moist eyes as Vanessa and Michael stopped before a stunning infrared print of Selena and her kittens. Michael leaned on his dark wood cane, his face reflecting a quiet, restorative peace that legal settlements or blood money could never provide. "She would have loved the light in this room," Dad Ethan said, coming to stand beside me. I nodded, squeezing his shoulder. "Eleanor didn't just preserve the land, Ethan. She preserved us." Later that afternoon, I found myself near the memorial darkroom, a space we had preserved exactly as Eleanor left it. I observed from the doorway as Vanessa and Michael Torres shared a private moment. Michael revealed then that he had taken the trust funds redirected from Derek's conviction money Derek had tried to use to bury our family and used them to start a scholarship for disabled hikers. It was a beautiful living apology. I realized then that the first mistake Eleanor mentioned at the very beginning of this journey was not just the name of a cheap motel in Niagara Falls. It was the Garrison family's history of choosing secrecy over truth, of burying pain instead of healing it. That cycle was now officially broken. I watched them shake hands, and for the first time, the shadow of the 2020 hit and run didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a foundation. 12 months, 52 videos, 1 dead husband-in-law, and 3 kittens that cost $60 million to protect. The magnitude of the cost was high, but as Michael smiled at my daughter, I knew the investment in the truth was worth every cent. After the final guests departed, and the hum of the server fans became the only sound in the house, I retreated to the porch. The brilliant cold twinkle of the Teton stars was so sharp, it felt like I could reach out and touch the celestial gears of the universe. I sat in Eleanor's favorite cedar chair and opened the final video file on my tablet. 365 days later, Eleanor appeared on the screen looking thinner and weaker than in the previous videos, yet she was radiant with a sense of completion. "Thane," she said, her voice a soft melody against the Wyoming wind. "I am so proud of the protagonist you became. You stopped being a spectator of tragedies and started being the architect of a sanctuary." She told me to finish the story beautifully and promised that she wasn't truly gone. She was part of the mountain wind, now part of the rustle in the pines. Eleanor's voice wasn't a recording anymore. It was the hum of the forest, the pulse of the lynx, and the steady, quiet beat of a heart that had finally learned how to forgive itself. I sat in the silence for a long time after the screen went black. "Eleanor, we did it," I whispered into the freezing dark. "The land is safe. The family is whole. Until tomorrow, my love, but only if you promise to live for today." Her final words echoed in my mind like a benediction. I felt a strange, transcendent peace. I was no longer the grieving widower clutching a brass key in a cold Chicago study. I was the sovereign protector of Timber Ridge. Just as I prepared to go back inside, a real-time notification chirped on my tablet. I looked down at the heat signature map. A single red blossom had appeared on the western ridge, sitting perfectly still on the rocky outcrop overlooking the lodge. It was Selena. She was exactly where Eleanor said she would be, watching over the sanctuary we had fought to keep. The distant, haunting howl of a lynx drifted through the trees, a wild, beautiful sound that confirmed the mountain was finally ours. I turned off the porch light and looked back at the warm, amber glow of the lodge windows. Eleanor was gone, but the legacy she had choreographed from the grave was glowing brighter than ever. For the first time in 67 years, I knew exactly who I was and where I was supposed to be. I wasn't just a man who taught stories. I was the man who had survived one. I stepped across the threshold and closed the door, the click of the lock sounding final and secure. The story of Thane Garrison and Timber Ridge concludes here, leaving a legacy of light in the heart of the Tetons. I was a man who believed wisdom came from books, not from the quiet truths inside my own home. I ignored signs, trusted too easily, and paid the price. If you take anything from this family story, don't wait for betrayal to teach you awareness. In many grandpa stories, we think time makes us safe, but it doesn't. Trust, but verify. Love, but stay awake. Even now, I believe God gave me a second chance, not just to survive, but to see clearly. This family story is my confession, my warning, and my redemption. Many grandpa stories end in silence, mine didn't. Learn before you lose. This family story exists so you won't repeat my mistakes. Some grandpa stories are meant to wake you up. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in my place facing betrayal from your own family? I'd truly value your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. Note: while inspired by real-life themes, parts of this story were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.